the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for the show that brings you more sides of the issues that matter. In the independent corner, I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together we shine, and we shine bright, bringing you news on the issues that matter. Together we also make up Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting into headlines this morning, we're going to be talking about the news, then we're passing it over to Jamarl to talk for a little bit, and then we're coming back, taking calls, and then going into a guest. First up, though, the news. Our first story, the Trump administration has released details on the executive commuted everything, the 3 years and 4 months of Stone's prison sentence, the 2 years of supervised release. The administration also ordered the remittance of any unpaid remainder of the $20,000 fine imposed on Stone as a part of his conviction. In our next story, we'll be talking, actually real quick, we're going to be talking about that first one with Roger Stone. At 9:30, we also had Tyler Nixon on yesterday, a member of Stone's legal counsel, his legal team broadly. And then later on at 9:30, we're going to be speaking with David Lugo a little bit about this case too. So if you want to hear more from people very closely tied in with real knowledge about what happened there and an interesting personal perspective, listen in then. That should be interesting. In any event, heading on to the next headline here. China's embassy in Washington says the United States is trying to sabotage regional peace in the South China Sea. This follows recent comments from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in which Pompeo said that China's pursuit of offshore resources in the vicinity of the Spratly Islands is, quote, completely unlawful, end quote, and that, quote, the world will not allow Beijing to treat the South China Sea as its maritime empire, end quote. China's embassy responded, saying the U.S., quote, deliberately distorts facts and international law, end quote. In our next story, California is closing down a wide array of indoor entertainment facilities, including its bars, restaurants, bowling alleys, gyms, hair salons, wineries, and places of worship. This follows an order from Governor Gavin Newsom last night, along with New Mexico, which is also sort of relocking down following a resurgence of new identified coronavirus cases. In Florida, they've had more than 27,000 new cases in a period of just 2 days. That would mean that if they were a country, they would be in 4th place in the world for reporting new coronavirus cases. Again, as a country, they would also rank 10th in the world for their total number of cases. That's just an interesting and kind of grim way to look at things. But there you go. Also, the coronavirus task force leader, Anthony Fauci, has said he is, quote, cautiously optimistic that at the end of the year, the beginning of this coming 2021, we will have more than one vaccine that would be available, end quote. We'll see about that. In our next story, the state of North Dakota is asking a federal appeals court to block a federal judge's order to shut down the Dakota Access Pipeline. The state is trying to keep the pipeline operational while the company that built it, Energy Transfer, appeals the shutdown order. This comes after last week a federal judge ordered the pipeline to be shut down by August 5th. That would be allowing for additional environmental assessment. In the United Kingdom, they're set to ban Huawei from their 5G plans. This follows a January decision by Boris Johnson to allow the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer, that is Huawei, to sell its products for use in the country. That's the United Kingdom, or Great Britain more broadly. Yeah, that's a sort of big step in this ongoing and apparently building tension between China and the United States. And it seems like Boris Johnson, and at least this pretty significant move, is pushing closer in the direction of the U.S. And in my last story today, before we turn it over to Jamarl, Washington's NFL team, the Redskins, is dropping its name today and logo in exchange for another name and another logo, which have not yet been revealed to the public. Some, however, that have been bandied about as replacements include the Washington Warriors. It's criticized for being a little bit too similar to the Redskins and maybe just another sort of step in this weird derogatory direction, a little bit closer to non-derogatory. But anyway, Another name might be the Red Tails, which is apparently it would be named after an all-black fighter pilot team in World War II. There's also the Washington Red Wolves, which would be a pretty simple transition in terms of the coloration and stuff, and this sort of fierce attitude or something that they're trying to go for with the Redskins. It's all maybe derogatory. and then the Washington Hogs, or Red Hogs even, going back to a 70s, 80s thing. I don't know too much about that one. Anyway, those are the alternatives there. We'll see what they come out with. Regardless, we'll see a lot more coming up soon. You're all caught up. Those are my headlines. That's my news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And with that, Jamarl, what is your top priority for today? What do you want to talk about?
So I want to talk about a letter that was written in Harper's by basically a litany of academics, including Noam Chomsky, that's getting a lot of, let's say, conversation and even pushback by people who are pushing back against the letter. Free speech is precisely for the speech you don't like. Noam Chomsky said that in one of his arguments when someone was pushing him on this issue of supporting basically people who have opinions that many people, especially in this day and age, find abominable. He was saying this back in like if I'm not mistaken, the 80s or whatever. But Chomsky, I honestly believe, is right on this. It's so unremorselessly sharp and piercing, and it cuts to really the root of the issue. Now, as I said, Chomsky was one of those people that assisted my workable point of view in the way I've looked at the world over the course of my life. And that was whether I agree with him or not. I at the very least understood where his point of view was coming from, especially on the issue of free speech. And I have found myself greatly agreeing with him on this very specific issue, even before I started my channel. So in the letter starts by, our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful protests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands of police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and arts. But this needed reckoning also has intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. Now, there's another part of this. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming constricted. While we have come to expect this on radical right, censoriousness, I think he's trying to make the point of censorship, is also spreading and more widely in our culture. And intolerance for opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and tendency to dissolve complex policy issues into a blinding moral certainty. How is he wrong? How is he wrong? Now, the catch is people have looked at this letter and say this letter is defending the right wing. You get it wrong. If you remember, this letter is just defending and upholding the principle that people in a liberal society should have the space and the ability to say things, even and especially when there are things that they don't particularly like. And I know recently this has been with blacks in vogue and with the society coming to this kind of consternation and reconciling with aspects of its history, aspects of its past that are just outright abominable. That may be true. And you may still have some people defending the old guard on this. But it is not for us to shut them up, as much as I disagree and as much as I greatly dislike what they're saying. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean there won't be speech against the abominable things that they're saying. And there's also something to be said about what is in your society that is generating people with this particular point of view, because that particular point of view is not coming out of an ether anywhere. But it is something to be said that the First Amendment was a weapon for African Americans, for gays, for women, basically for anybody that wasn't a white, straight male in their pursuit, in addition to protests, in addition to ruckus. But it was a weapon and has been in pursuit of justice. And it is one of those things that this country cannot afford to lose, regardless of which side the weapon is being used on. Who chooses, right? I mean, we're stuck in a world without any necessary God giving us right and wrong, and we're stuck with trying to discern what's right and wrong. And at various points of our society, there have been things that have been absolutely and entirely right that have been politically unpalatable and have been attempted to be shut down, especially on the issue of civil rights. How do I, as an African American man, in a society that was viciously hostile to my interests, and still have those people to have the right under the law, whether that right was broken, flagrantly abused, or anything else, but at the very least, that was there to be utilized in order to push rights forward. And keep in mind, this is not just an issue for the right, even though right now this is how this level is being explained. Donahue, anti-war, kicked off the air. Glenn Greenwald. When is the last time you've seen Glenn Greenwald on MSNBC? Jesse Ventura. They bought Jesse Ventura's contract to keep him off the air when they found out Jesse Ventura was anti-war. Suspending and the backlash over the Tom Cardin article. As atrocious and horrific and outlandish and hysterical that article was written by Tom Cardin. Tom Cardin is in Congress, and he has that particular political perspective. And the idea that you're going to attack somebody for allowing Tom Cardin to give that unhinged political perspective is a little out there, to put it mildly, considering, again, he's a senator member of Congress with that particular political perspective, and unfortunately, a lot of people in the country agreeing with him. How do you shut down a point of view, even if it's atrocious, when you have a large share of your public with that point of view? And what is wrong with your public that it is coming to that particular point of view regarding the society that's arranging them to come to that particular point of view? Now, I say that because if they were on a completely different planet, that wouldn't come up. Your society generates certain outcomes, and it doesn't want to deal with those outcomes in a way of systemically. It wants to deal with them by trying to shut up the speech that brings up and elucidates the problem to the surface. I can't be for that. The Star Trek episode that was not aired in the UK because it didn't necessarily like Star Trek trying to reconcile issues of terrorism when Britain was going through its own issues of terrorism with the IRA. I'm trying to make the point that free speech is indeed there for the speech you don't like, because at any particular point, your society changes. The tenor of that society changes. And the ability to articulate what is wrong with that society, especially from your point of view of reality that you're experiencing in that. It doesn't mean you're right. It doesn't even mean that you're coming at this from a larger, greater perspective of wanting to expand the rights of the majority of the population. You could be a horrific person. But should I take it upon myself, or for that matter, a group of the society take it upon themselves to extinguish their ability to articulate themselves? And do I believe that the extinguishing of that ability to articulate themselves will somehow eliminate them from the point of view? Or will that fester into something else? If your society is indeed having problems where it is either generating certain points of view, whether it is reconciling certain points of view that it had prior, you have to deal with that. And I'm sorry, dealing with that is not pretending that it doesn't exist. Dealing with that is not even necessarily not saying anything about the onerous or the horrific perspectives. It is, however, having a society that allows a certain degree of open debate. And this notion of canceling becomes problematic to me. The same thing, by the way, can be done here. The same thing can be done with Radio Sputnik. The same thing can be done with my channel or Door's channel or any of these other channels that they don't particularly like. This cancellation effect is not something specific and entirely total to the right. It is basically for anybody who is in power who doesn't necessarily like what is being said in opposition. And that, if you look over the course of history, changes. And for the longest time, that has been from the standpoint of issues pertaining to the left. Be very careful with what you ask for in regards to trying to get people to platform, to get people removed. You can make commentary against them, have at it. But whether or not there should be a systemic, explicit policy of eliminating elements of speech that are not liked, be aware, at some point, you will be held to that same policy. Shane, what do you think about this? I don't accept it as being completely simplistic, because there are consequences to being able to allow people to say really horrific things. By the same token, I don't know how to balance it when I know that reality doesn't give us a God's perspective on this stuff. And so we're stuck with, how do we navigate in a world like this? And to me, free speech has to be protected, even when it's horrible speech.
Well, as far as I can tell, that's the only kind of speech that we think should be worth protecting, because it's not, if it's not obviously horrible, then there's nobody trying to get it not said, just plainly. I think another side of this, we got to go into a break. We're going to talk about this more on the other side of this break. We're also going to be taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Real quick, though, and I'll come back on this, I think. The problem here, and we don't know how to deal with this, is that this is a mass cultural movement. It's not a government trying to repress people's freedom of speech in most of these cases. It's a mass cultural movement with its own sort of legitimate philosophical perspectives. I disagree with them, but if you want to deal with it, I think you need to deal with it on those grounds. Maybe we can get into that. Again, we're going into a break. You can call in 202-521-1320. We'll be back in just a minute to talk more about this issue of cancel culture, this letter at Harper's signed by Noam Chomsky, J.K. Rowling, a bunch of others. Be back in just a minute. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Hi, this is Max Kaiser. I'm here with Stacey Herbert, and we're doubling down.
Yeah, we're doubling down on crazy. We're doubling down on our new show called Double Down on Sputnik. It's doubling down on absolute joyous radio nirvana. You will love it. You will want to listen to every single episode on Sputnik. Bye, y'all.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Again, we're taking calls this segment on the issue of cancel culture. You can call in to our number, 202-521-1320 is the right number to call. So feel free to call in there. Yeah, just following back up. We're talking about the Harper's letter. We're talking about this issue generally of cancel culture. As far as I can tell, there's this continuum of activity that is economic activity, and cancel culture is largely economic. You're trying to get people fired, for instance. You're trying to get people kind of extirpated, ripped up out of their economic support system, and that isolates them, and then they're sort of shown as a negative role model for what not to do for other people to learn to not imitate. Basically, that's the whole point. Is taking people. A problem with this has as far as I can tell, there's a long history of scapegoating. It's like a deeply human thing to scapegoat, and if I think that's actually a pretty valid model to use for what's going on here. You're taking people, in a lot of cases, people who said something that was offhanded, that was racist or whatever it was, but it was in a moment, usually in these sort of private moments, in these private spaces. You're taking that and you're sort of using that as a frame of reference. You're blowing that out of proportion, because again, if that kind of thing is relatively common and relatively low harm, except as this support system for some sort of systemic narrative, I mean, that's where this stuff gets complicated. How are you going to, and I'm again, you can tell I'm kind of thinking about this as I'm saying it, so please pardon me if this is a little bit unclear, but how are you going to deal with not just the idea of these systemic perspectives? I don't even know how to talk about this, because usually the phrase is systemic racism, but as far as I can tell, the whole point is trying to change people's perspectives about any variety of bigotry or any variety of whatever the term would apply, you'd apply in each circumstance. And then you're trying to change their views so that the sort of system of culture changes in response to that. But is that the right way to go about doing things? Is that the right way? I mean, you're talking, I'll send it back to you in just a second. You're talking about cultural change. And I'm going to sort of put up a little straw man here, and maybe we can both look at it from different sides. If you want to change the society, if you want to change the social outlook on things, isn't the right way to do that, to do cancel culture? Isn't this just part of that sort of broader quiver of approaches you can bring? Just another arrow in that sort of general take you can have on solving that social problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I've thought about that. I mean, that has crossed my mind. Like, if you are, like, pretend for the moment that society was a person, and in society being just a person had certain points of view. How does it work through those points of view? I would imagine it would work through them like any other person. You would have these pangs of ideas, pangs of opinion that at some point you consciously believes needs to be changed. And that's not something that takes place overnight for a person, let alone for a society that's grappling from the despotism of slavery and has to work its way over the course of that time now. The catch here, though, is a lot of this applies not just to people who say things in private moments. Tucker Carlson, for example, doesn't get on his show and say things in a private moment. The problem that I think people have is that racism is not hard and fixed. It's not appointed by God to say this statement is racist or not. There are some statements that are perversely racist. There are others that are subjective. And I think a lot of people run into problems when they take their subjectivity for something that's a flat fact, word of God type thing. There are things that are, again, people have their experiences. So me growing up as an African-American male in my society, under the conditions of culture, under the conditions of what my government and what my country tells me is right and wrong, what it shows as being appropriate and available, for that matter, the things that I'm denied in my process of trying to operate through the society. All of those things have effects on how that person sees the world. But that's for Hispanic, gay, straight, white, etc. And all of those experiences are valid. The problem that we have is trying to reconcile all of those experiences into this kind of hegemonic norm where we can interact and get along with one another, where it doesn't necessarily feel like we are being aggrieved in some way or limited in our actions. And those actions do include, to some degree, speech. And again, some of these experiences in which people are brought up in will elicit aspects of speech that are not necessarily the greatest. By the same token, unless you have those conversations, you can't even deal with it. This is kind of my problem with this. It's like, yes, I understand you can make an argument that it's not cancel culture back in the 60s when the shift changed between the way you talked about, let's say, gays or blacks or whatever. But people still had that point of view. And during that time frame, the main point of view was against that level of speech of being African American, meaning for like a Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, or even for that matter, today, what you would probably consider Farrakhan. Like, those things, to some degree, are required because sometimes those things pull our society in ways that are in the best interests of our society, but the society doesn't necessarily want to deal with them in a moment. Right-wingers have taken this, and unfortunately, this is a level of speech you just have to deal with. And I don't necessarily think hiding it or trying to make it as if it's not a thing is a way of going about it, even though a decent and legitimate argument could be made that, hey, if you don't want those things brought up in your society and people replicating the opinions, then maybe you shouldn't have those opinions that are visible. I guess the main question for that is, do those opinions go away if you try to hide those opinions? Let's take a few callers. We have Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, what's going on?
Oh, good morning, gentlemen. I want to talk about George Soros. I'm trying to explain why he's a crucial person in history and why so many people don't like him, and especially in different countries. Okay, what George Soros does, he's an hedge fund manager. He have a whole bunch of people that's backing him, and he goes into a country. And he invests in the stock market, right? Pumping up the volume of the stock market, the prices of things. So people 401k is doing good, pensions doing good, and everything. Then we saw George do within 6 months to a year, maybe 2 or 3 years. He's pulled it out. Then he pulled all his money out, okay? And once he does that, it causes panic. And sometimes what he would do, he would short the market too, so he can make money as that market collapse on itself. So what happens is, in that particular country, like he tried to do in Malaysia, what happens is pensions get messed up, 401ks, all that. The banking system get messed up and everything. So when a president stands up against them or a prime minister stands up against them, George Soros, what he does is he invests or he put money into NGOs, which is non-government organizations. And these people, some of these non-government NGOs might have some beefs, legitimate beefs with the current prime minister or president. But what they don't know is they have other people that might be coming in, telling them how to protest, telling them how to do this and do that. And what happens is it causes a social structure. Then the government have to spend more money that it don't have on police and things of that nature. And then the crowd get turned against the president heavily, especially around election year, and that president will lose his position as president, right? He get voted out. Then they're bringing somebody else that's friendly to George Soros and those that want to deregulate everything. That's when you see nations start selling off their own natural resources at dollars, pennies on a dollar, land, selling all type of stuff. The rates drop and everything. Slave labor come in. The unions get destroyed.
Just to interrupt real quick, how is this different from what the IMF does?
That's what I'm leading to. The president also signed a contract with the IMF, whereas the new president will sign a contract with the IMF, whereas the old president probably wasn't dealing with it. So it's either George Soros, he'll do it, or the IMF. But George Soros will do it the other way, where he'll put money into NGOs to cause the problem to make the problem even worse after causing a rush on the market by taking out all this money. So it's not just George Soros. Yes, it's the IMF and other things that goes along with it too. But that's why he's not a good person. You see what I'm saying? Well,
I do. Yeah, Tarif. No, thank you very much for that. No, I don't. Here's the thing. We've got two other callers we want to get to. That was a very good factual breakdown. I just want to briefly distill it. What you're saying is he creates an economic crisis. He profits from that crisis, and simultaneously he sets up a sort of toolkit, a little apparatus in the form of these NGOs for the civil side of things, for affecting the political society that he's trying to affect. And this is where that ties into his focus on civil society as a whole. Is this book, The Alchemy of Finance, I want to go back and read. Soros is a really interesting figure, and yeah, I agree. I don't like him very much. It seems like he's using this in a pretty manipulative, personally enriching way. That he probably has his own ideas about what society should look like and stuff, and that affects how he does things. But I don't agree with those ideas for the most part. Anyway, thank you so much, Tarif. That was great. I just wanted to let you go, and then we need to move on a little bit to other callers. Let's go to, I believe the next one would be Ty. Ty from Washington.
Hey, this is Shane and Jamarl.
Yeah, you're on. Ty, what's going on? How's it going?
Howdy. Thanks for taking the call. I want to you gentlemen about the cancel culture and conceptually what I believe it stems from. I'm going to date myself a little bit. You guys were talking about the Communications Act 25 years ago. I actually wrote a college column about that. So give you a little bit of age how I am, but I've actually been in newsrooms back when I was a journalist. We have a strong history of debate legacy on the right and the left. Historically, I used to watch the McLaughlin Group. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, Jamal, but they used to have really, really heated discussions. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of that, and I'm glad you brought up Phil Donahue and Jesse Ventura, because a lot of this, I think, is the corporatizing. We can talk about the legal side, the academic side, and the public debate side, which are different levels. Obviously, you kind of alluded to that. But I think this discussion now is more about coddling of elites. You brought up, for example, Tom Cotton. Now, by definition, in my opinion, Tom Cotton can't be denied a platform because by definition, he's a senator. So he can issue press releases. He can be on Face the Nation. He has a ton of platform. I have no problem with him issuing something or writing a column for the New York Times. But ask yourself this. Where's the person on the New York Times board or op-ed board that's anti-war? And so you
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. But would you agree with me that that's a societal point of view almost? I mean, when they killed Soleimani, their response, when you ask the public, the majority, it was like 51% say, yeah, clean kill. That's astonishing. I mean, so it's like Tom Cotton is not, it's like, it's as unhinged as that point of view. That has been a point of view that has been nursed and seeded into our culture for the last 40-something years, if not longer.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. That seems. And now, criticizing his speech did not take away his popularity. It's not going to take away his position. But you look at someone like Jesse Ventura or Glenn Greenwald or someone like that. That was part of a long-term purging. And this idea of, let's just look at some of the signatories of this letter. Let's just get back specifically to this letter. Barry Weiss, she spent her entire first part of her career trying to get people.
Michael, wait. Michael, we're going to have to, please stay on the line or give us a call back at like 8 o'clock or 8:15 so we can have this conversation again and go through this conversation a little bit further. I appreciate the call, though, and we'll definitely get back to it. But Ty, I'm sorry.
First time caller, as far as I know. Great call, Ty. Yeah, please call back and just reiterating what Jamarl was just saying there.
Absolutely. And so we're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to Thomas and Stranahan. Great conversations, fault lines. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. A quick shout out for people who are in the DC area. If you want to catch us on the air in DC, you can. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, you can listen to us 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM out there. Also 1140 AM out there. If you want to listen to us online from practically anywhere in the world, except ones that have, really big firewalls up, you can listen to us Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Music, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Periscope. Go over to Twitter, twitter.com/faultlinesradio. Subscribe to our Twitter, and you'll see up top the Periscope live feed going on right now. Also over on YouTube, I just mentioned that, but over on YouTube, we have 2 streams going up most of the time. Fault Lines Radio, if you do a search for that, you can subscribe there. Also, Jamarl Thomas, the Jamarl Thomas channel, Progressive Soapbox. You'll see we have another live feed going on there. Go like, subscribe, and share both of those videos. We're going into a segment here. We're going to be talking with Mark Frost. Mark, we'll get to you in about 40 seconds. We have one caller left over. Maybe we can we'll see where this takes us. But Michael from Sydney, let's keep it pretty short. Great to have you on. But we want to go with Mark here. But thank you for the call. Michael, what's on your mind?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Look, I was just wanted to pick up on the fact, suppressing people's speech has never led to it going away. It just pushes it underground, and it usually comes out in violent forms. I mean, we've been fighting anti-Semitism for the best part of 100 years now. It hasn't gone away. It's just pushed it underground. It comes out in more virile and violent forms. Also, I mean, you got people like Hillary Clinton, calling, black men super predators. But yet, she's fully accepted by the Democratic Party, who are out there, championing, the cancel culture and criticizing Trump. You got people like Joe Biden, who's signed the crimes bill and was the sponsor of the crimes bill and created all that stuff. But basically, open persecution of black people in Europe is going to lead to a massive increase in people going to jail, particularly African American and minorities. And also you got this Russophobia coming out of the Democrats as well. No one's questioning, the fact that Democratic senators and politicians are saying Russians are genetically designed and biased with lying and being sneaky.
I believe that was James Clapper. I believe that was James Clapper. I'm going to cut it there. Please call back in though, Mike. I always like when you call, and I don't mean to cut you short. I just want to make sure that we have enough time with Mark Frost, our guest that we're bringing on right now. Let's just do it. Mark, I'll give you the intro after we introduce you, but how are you doing this morning?
Very good. I moved, I'm unpacked, I'm rested. My body has healed from doing manual labor that I am not used to. So
good to hear.
Good.
Good to hear. Yeah, and I bet on the other side of that kind of thing, I usually feel a bit better, even though I'm worn down. A couple days later, though, you heal up. For people who are listening, Mark Frost is an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine. He's also libertarian-ish. We'll get into some of the economic stuff there. We're also going to be talking about coronavirus. Maybe we can talk about that. I'll put it like this. We have the topic right now. Civil unrest is a function, not the function of the pandemic. Talking about civil unrest, we were just having a conversation about cancel culture. This is operating on a continuum. Clearly, the Black Lives Matter movement that we're seeing, that is the sort of chief protest movement right now in the United States, is a cultural movement, at least in part. And it directly ties into this issue. So maybe we can touch on that real quick. But real quick, another shout out. If you want to follow Mark on Twitter, you can. You can check out what he's saying, what he's putting down, where he's coming from. Frosty Cash, Frostie Cash. And with that out of the way, thank you again for joining us. I don't know how much you were listening to
Thank you.
before.
It's good to be back on.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Yeah, thank you. We're just talking about this letter from Harper's. I don't mean to dwell on this unnecessarily because after all, this isn't what we brought you on to talk about. But real quick, have you seen that the 100 and something signatories? I think maybe not quite that many, but quite a few signatories. Chomsky, J.K. Rowling. We mentioned Barry Weiss earlier. Margaret Atwood is a big one that we haven't mentioned. What do you think of that? If you've seen that, Mark?
Yeah, I have seen it. It's certainly outside of my, forte of the kind of things that I feel like I have something special to say. The only thing that I do feel about it is I have no problem putting my name on a petition with Noam Chomsky, who is probably the opposite of how I view the world. We have the opposite sense of life. But if he says something correct, he says something correct. Somehow, over the last few years, we've got to a point where we can't even agree with people unless we agree with everything they've ever said. I bet you Stalin, who I think is one of the worst human beings to have ever lived, probably has a quote out there that I would agree with on some topic, and this thought that we have to all have perfect 100% correlation of our views to have any benefit from joining forces with each other, to me is just nuts.
Well, yeah, it is nuts.
I don't get it. I don't claim to understand it. So
it's insane because it does exactly the opposite of the thing that you'd expect or that you'd want, which is you'd want people to talk their issues out. You'd want them to actually have a conversation about it, not go straight to the ad hominem or the deplatforming or the canceling or whatever the case is. But that's not what happens. Instead, people are restricted from talking to each other. The views that they don't like are sort of pushed as far into the other corner as they can get them, and it keeps people apart. And we see that happening with the pandemic response. We've had guests on over the last 5-6 months we've disagreed about stuff with, and then we've had guests who wouldn't come on because they really didn't like the way we were covering things. The first is pretty good, and when you can make it work, the first is productive. You get stuff out of it because you have that genuine conversation. The second, just nothing happens, and I'm afraid that we're moving more towards the second as a society. But that was a sort of rough segue back into the topic that we had established to talk about. I see you were talking about the pandemic. We've had you on before, actually. The last time we had you on, we were talking about our response to the pandemic, the sort of cost-benefit analysis of how many lives would be lost from the pandemic if it were completely uninhibited, and then how many lives would be lost if we did the economic shutdown, which we, to a large extent, have done and continue to do. I'm curious, where are you on that stuff now, and how would you, if you were trying to improve our society's response, if you're trying to do it from the perspective of a free and functioning civil society and a state, how would you deal with the pandemic with that stuff in mind?
Well, I've been certainly just my Twitter record. I've been a critic of the shutdown since the first shutdown. But that said, the shutdown wasn't a command decision by the President of the United States that said, we're going to shut down. It was a combination of government shutting things down, but it was also a combination of consumers that was impacting demand. The shutdown actually began before the first formal supply shock, which literally ordered things to shut down. So I was against the shutdown, and it's less for economic reasons and more for ideological reasons, because in a free society, at least from my libertarian way of looking at things, there's certain things that government doesn't get to do for any reason. One of them, for instance, is the death penalty. From an economic perspective, does the death penalty deter crime? Probably does. We can go to places like Saudi Arabia and look at the cruel way they execute people. It certainly has an impact. But from a libertarian perspective, which is where I always come from, property rights, the fundamental piece of property we own is ourselves, that sort of a thing. So on that note, there are some things government just shouldn't be able to do. Are there people that I can't stand the crime they do? It's so hideous. I myself want to shoot them in the head. Yes, but I don't want to institutionally give government that kind of power. So I don't believe, for any reason, government should have the power to take people's businesses away from them. without compensation. It's a fundamental core belief I have. Now, when I move on to the economics and I want to start trying to measure it, right now there's not enough data to truly, there hasn't been enough time and data for us to truly do a post-mortem and say what would have been better. And it's a hard gig to do from an economic abatement perspective, because we're literally putting a value on statistical human lives. To some folks, it's literally an immoral act to say, okay, we'll shut down if it saves 2 million lives, but if it only saves 1 million, it's not worth it. Well, that's literally what economists do. And I'm the type of economist that doesn't believe an economist can tell you what should be done. We can tell you the price of doing something and the price of not doing something. And that takes philosophers, political economists, people their entire lives are about what is the moral proper thing for us to do. Because an economist can't tell you what the moral thing to do. I have to put a different hat on to engage in that conversation. But one thing that I know for sure, without any doubt whatsoever, is the shutdown itself causes death, pain, agony. But the difference is most of that death, pain, and agony isn't immediate. It's going to be felt for years and years and years. We've added about $10 trillion of printed debt in this country between the Federal Reserve and the actual bailouts. And that will have repercussions in the economy on the long term. And when I say long term, I mean going into decades. I feel exceptionally sorry for 15-year-olds right now that in 10 years are going to have to deal with the economic blunders that I believe that we've made right now. One other one is...
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No. I was going to say we have about 2 minutes left. But the topic of conversation is the civil unrest is a function, not a function of the pandemic response. So what would you call the civil unrest if it's not, if it's a function of the primary stat, not the function of the pandemic response? Like, I guess what I'm getting into is within 2 minutes, because we're going to bring you back for the next 15 minutes. What do you consider to be the reason for the civil unrest if it's not the response of the pandemic, if that makes sense? Like, because this is kind of insinuates that the response to the pandemic is a driver of the protest, but not necessarily the reason for the protest. So what would you consider to be the reason to be?
Well, I think the reason for the protest is there is a sense, and this is where I try to be very empathic to people. I think there is a sense in this country by a lot of subgroups that the country is great for a lot of people, but not for them. There really are two Americas. There is an America that's thriving right now. My business is booming because everybody's buying contactless payments. But there are people whose businesses they don't have any demand. They're losing their dreams. And there are two Americas. And I think conservatives sometimes forget that there's that anger is like a spring. And the more it's compressed, the more power that goes behind it. So I don't argue that the shutdown and the bailout and the stimulus caused the protest. I argue that it is a function, not the function. So it's almost like you had a perfect storm. You had this feeling of disenfranchisement of a large section of people. Then you had a series of hideous murders by cops. Then you had a lot of people that had just been at home going nuts, wanting anything to get out. And this perfect storm of dozens of variables came into play. And what happened to the magnitude that it happened, not because of one thing or two things or three things, but because a plethora of variables came together at the same time. And it made the present what it is. Now, that being said, now there's all sorts of sub-factions that are using what happened to their own sort of political advantage. And
we can pick up that conversation
libertarians,
on the other side of this
liberals,
break.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. We're going to go into a break now. We can pick that up. I also have a question for you about public goods when it comes to this stuff and organizing, and the question of whether basically creating a response to the pandemic in terms of public safety would itself be a public good, and then there's how that ties into libertarian economic policies in the Virginia School. Just giving you a lead there on what I'm planning on asking about on the other side. We'll be back in a minute. We're going into a break right now. We're joined by Mark Frost, libertarian-ish economist, and we'll be back with him to talk about our pandemic response. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. I am Shane Stranahan. My co-host is Jamarl Thomas. You can hear him come on in a second. Jamarl, why don't you say hi?
Hello, everyone. I'm here.
There we go. Sorry for calling you out like that. It's a little bit silly. I like to do that. We are joined by Mark Frost. You'll hear his voice in a second. Mark is an libertarian economist, economics professor too. So here's where I was going with this thing. I talked about public goods. There's this idea of public choice theory. Where you're basically taking economic tools and applying them to political science. This had some, as far as I can tell, this has become a sort of influence, a deeper influence on specifically America's way of doing things. Like this idea of the nudge. Cass Sunstein is the more known for this, but it seems like he was influenced by this tradition of sort of passively trying to influence people's behavior. Now that can get very, very quickly very shady. Again, we live in a society that is, as far as I can tell, very propagandized. And if you're trying to nudge people, if you have tools for figuring out how to nudge people and you can just sort of subtly, passively nudge them in directions you want to go, there's a lot to be afraid of there. But then you can also apply that same tool set, this public choice theory, to looking at problems of, again, political economy or political science. And it seems like this pandemic would be one of those problems. It seems like you have this failure of the commons, this sort of tragedy of the commons thing, where people are playing this iterated prisoner's dilemma, and people who aren't wearing masks. I agree, it should be a cultural thing, but how do we get there? People who aren't wearing masks are sort of defecting, and then you see those people defecting, and it causes this whole social fracas. And then, of course, other people are slightly less willing to do it, and this is both driven by and further driving the intense political polarization in our society. Anyway, Mark, where I was going with this is, it seems like there is this sort of spectrum of conversation we could be having on when and in what ways we should try to passively influence people's behavior, including for something as much of an emergency as this, like a pandemic. What's your take on that issue? Where do you think I'm going wrong in my interpretation or my analysis there?
Let's define public good, first of all, because there's a specific meaning of it in economics. And to a layperson, to most of your listeners, they probably think of public good as just what the English words mean. But a public good, from an economic perspective, is one that is non-excludable in supply. Once it's been supplied, there's no way to stop other people from using it, meaning they can free ride on it. There's no way to charge people for it. So for instance, let's assume no government, and I live next door to Bill Gates. He's going to be well protected. He's going to have defense. He'll probably even have nukes. And I get a windfall benefit from free riding on him. I don't have to contribute to any self-defense because I live so close to his property. It's in his interest to protect me as well as to protect him. So he can't exclude that. But it's also non-rival in consumption, meaning one person's consumption of it in no way reduces the ability of somebody else's consumption of it. A classic example was when HBO first started. They figured out real quick, once they broadcast it through the satellite, once they supplied it, it was non-excludable at that time, and anybody could consume it, and it wasn't like a wire-based one. One person's consumption of it didn't in any way reduce the other ones. Well, they fixed that problem by encrypting their signal, and it ceased being a public good. So that's what economists mean when that phrase is used, public good. Now, excuse me. Now answering your question, I think you mentioned masks. I think what you're saying, what your premise was that wearing a mask would be a public good. Is that did I interpret you correctly?
Yeah, well, there's this weird application of it, and admittedly, I'm not an economist. I'm using terms I only partially understand. But here's what I mean: you can think of a sort of an abstract good, something like health or freedom or safety, and then you can figure out various ways in which that good can be attained, and that good is non-rivalrous, it's non-excludable. Safety, again, which different ways you can look at it. Maybe and this is silly. You're safe from the virus if the people around you aren't going to give it to you. And you can get there by a variety of means. But and it's a weird thing to bring up because, again, it's a sort of negative definition. It's the absence of something, and those are always tricky. But those can also be useful sometimes when we're trying to analyze things. That's specifically what I meant. It wasn't specifically masks. It was this idea of safety from the virus, which it seems can be viewed as something that, you can attain in a society. That seems like the whole point of this thing. Is trying to get that safety. I
see what you're saying. Okay. I don't think that would really be a public goods sort of analysis. I think that's an externalities sort of analysis. So, for instance, education is the classic positive externality. When you consume education, the argument is, of course, it benefits you, but it also benefits society. You're a more educated, more productive, more aware person, and that helps society as a whole. Likewise, there's negative externalities, things that are supplied or used that have additional costs to others besides the actual person. So an argument for wearing masks from an economic perspective would be the non-mask wearers, given the premise that masks actually do prevent transmission, that non-mask wearers are imposing a negative externality against society because, yes, they have the right to do that, but they're doing it at a cost of zero. If they had to pay for the marginal damage that refusing to wear the mask imposed on society, they would be more likely to wear a mask. That would be, I think, that would be the mask economics there, in my view. On that note, because I have access to all the academic articles from all the databases, from JSTOR to everything else, I've been searching for a real academic study on masks to see what they do, because I don't know. And if you listen to the news, for instance, or if you listen to mainstream media, it seems to be almost like a religion. And, most economists are naturally skeptical when everybody believes something. We're like, okay, this is not a lot of data is being thrown out. Everybody says, listen to scientists. So if you go actually look at articles, the best one I could find was one that did a study with hamsters, and they put N95 mask material in between the cages. They purposely infected the left side cage, and they measured to see what the incidence of the other cage of which the material was in between, and they came up and they determined that masks did significantly reduce transmission. Well, the hamsters weren't wearing masks. And in economics, one of the things we want to look at is the unintended consequences of it. So I've just made it a point to talk to people in the retail industry that are wearing these things, and I observe them. And what I observe is, at least where I live, at least 8 out of 10 that wear them have them around their chin, or they have them around their nose, or just at, I won't mention the name of the place, but it was a breakfast place. I ate breakfast at a place the other day, and the woman kept fiddling with her masks, She kept readjusting it. She scratched her eye. She pulled it down below her nose because she needed to say something to me. Then she took my credit card, handed me a pen. I handed the pen back to her. So even if we have a laboratory study, what economists love to point out is often in the real world, outside of the laboratory, things work differently than what we suspect. I just posted an article on
Mark,
masks.
let me interrupt.
That's very interesting. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's interesting.
Let me interrupt for 1 second.
Sure,
But
please.
assume for the moment. I mean, I don't necessarily think that all of the doctors and all of the nurses that are in these ICU units are using masks in a perfunctory way. I mean, I think they're using them because they consider the protection as being something that protects them and keeps them alive. If that is indeed true, say for the moment that, I don't know, a God study come out and says, yes, this is indicative of something that protects. And I think logically, we can look at the notion of the transmission of droplets just in the mechanical process by which we're saying that this virus has passed, either for droplets hanging in the air or for that matter, just in communication with one another, that those things can be passed on, that a mask would naturally, just logically prevent the droplets from exceeding your mouth into somebody else's frame of reference. I guess he's trying to make a basic point about whether or not, if you could find out, or if we know, that the propensity of the virus goes down as people wear more masks, should it not be something that is just kind of mandated when people are going into buildings and going into businesses, regardless of what the owner of the business wants?
Well, it might be, but if anyone that studies economics, there are all sorts of things that people take as logically common sense that are later debunked. And I'm not saying people shouldn't wear masks. I personally, rather than ask people what they should do, ask them what they actually do. I wear a mask when I go out. I'm not sure that they are effective, but I wear one, if only not to stress out the people that really get nervous when they see somebody that doesn't have a mask.
I'm one of them. I am one of those people. So I appreciate you wearing it. Now, look, we have about 2 minutes left.
I understand that.
We have about 2 minutes left, and I do want to get to something else. From your perspective of the world, how should we deal with this? Meaning all of the economic issues, all of these kind of perfect storm issues that have all come about. I am always fascinated by how people believe that we should kind of get ourselves out of this kind of quagmire. From your perspective as an economist and as a libertarian-ish economist, how should we extricate ourselves from this as a country if you were whispering in the ear of somebody who's in charge?
If I was whispering in the ear of somebody that was in charge, if somebody was actually listening to me, I would say, why hasn't there been a concerted strategy? Because I didn't agree with the shutdown. But once the shutdown happened, that's called fixed cost in economic language. Once you paid the fixed cost, by definition, it's fixed. And what you don't want to do is pay it again. So once the shutdown happened, it isn't like a society is a light switch where you can turn on the economy and you can turn it off just quickly like that. So now that we've bit that bullet, we've done the stimulus, we've done all the things that we need to do, or we've done all the things that we have chosen to do. We have to live with that decision. And what I think we've done is this: almost we've Balkanized the strategy here so that there is no concerted strategy. We'll never really know whether the shutdown did this or did that because it was so piecemeal. Some states have done this, some states have done that, and it's exceptionally difficult. But to answer your question, if I was in charge, I think what you're asking, if I was king, what would I do? Open up the schools. I would open up the economy. I would divert massive amounts of resources into hospitals, the supply chain. I would fight. the virus medically.
Mark, we're going to have to end it here. Man, I always enjoy when you come on. I always think it's good conversations. We're listening to economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, Libertarianish, Mark Frost. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We'll be back momentarily.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And in the independent corner, we have...
I am your investigative radio show host, Shane Stranahan. Man, I'm having problems with my mic today, but happy to be here. Thank you.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, these are kind of the issues associated with doing this remotely. So that just kind of happens. And so nice catching up, Shane. Excellent. You guys can bear with us on that. Now, let's get to some headlines. In the news, the Trump administration has released details on an executive order commuting sentence of Roger Stone. This comes at a request from Amy Berman Jackson, the judge who presided in the Stone's criminal case. Now, Trump commuted this everything, 3 months, 4 years of his prison sentence, the 2 years of supervised release, and the administration remitted in any unpaid of the remainder of the $20,000 fine. China Embassy in Washington says the United States is trying to sabotage regional peace in the South China Sea. This follows recent comments from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in which he said that China's pursuit of offshore resources in the vicinity of Spratly Island is completely unlawful, quote unquote, and that the world would not allow Beijing to treat the South China Sea as its maritime empire. China Embassy said the United States, quote unquote, deliberately distorts facts and international law. I would argue that international law doesn't, in fact, exist. California is closing down a wide array of indoor entertainment facilities, including its bars, restaurants, bowling alleys, gyms, hair salons, wineries, and places of worship, following an order from Governor Newsom last night, along with New Mexico. Now, Florida has more than 27,000 new cases in a period of just 2 days, and if it were a country, it would be 4th place in the world for reporting new COVID-19 cases, and would rank 10th in the world for its total number of cases. Coronavirus Task Force leader Anthony Fauci has said that he is, quote unquote, cautiously optimistic that at the end of the year, the beginning of this coming 2021, we will have more than one vaccine that would be available. The state of North Dakota is asking a federal appeals court to block federal judge order that shut down the Dakota Access Pipeline. The state is trying to keep the pipeline operational while the company, Energy Transfer, appeals the shutdown order. This comes after last week a federal judge ordered that the pipeline to be shut down by August the 5th and allow additional environmental assessment. The United Kingdom is set to ban Huawei from its 5G plans. How fast that changed. This follows a January decision by Boris Johnson to allow the world's largest telecommunications manufacturers to sell its products for use in the country. That also means that the UK will be backwards in tech for political reasons. Washington's NFL team, the Redskins, is dropping its name and logo today in exchange for another name and another logo, which have not yet been revealed to the public. Some that have been banded as a replacement include the Washington Warriors, the Washington Red Tails, the Washington Red Wolves, and the Washington Hogs, or for that matter, the Red Hogs. You are listening, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There are a few of these stories that I find really, really interesting. The 5G one is interesting, but also the one with China and the South China Sea. Now, if we remember, Pompeo is the guy who used to be director of the CIA for Donald Trump. Pompeo was caught in front of a crowd that applauded him as he said, I lie, cheat, and steal for a living. And the crowd, strangely enough, heard that and says, yes, those are the values we want to emulate. Lying, cheating, and stealing. Yes, that's our guy. Now, that guy who bragged about lying and cheating and stealing for a living is now working in the State Department, Secretary of State. Now, the fact that Pompeo gets out there and says whatever Pompeo says, I've just accepted at this point that Pompeo tends to lie through his teeth. Pompeo is also the guy that laughed about killing Russians, something that wasn't necessarily all that much raised up to a high profile, because for obvious reasons, if you raise that to a high profile, you have to deal with that issue, and that becomes an international crisis. That did not stop Pompeo from joking about it. I guess the thing is, when you get somebody who brags about lying, cheating, and stealing, well, you kind of have to accept them at their word that they are probably lying if they are opening their mouth. The notion that China doesn't have control over areas around China and it's a major power is strange, considering that the United States had a policy of explicit domain over South America. We still use that policy today. You don't believe me? The Monroe Doctrine? Look at what we've done to Venezuela. Look at what we were doing to Ecuador. Look at the role we played in Bolivia and the coups that took place. Look at Hillary Clinton bragging about Honduras and saying, no, it wasn't a coup, even though the guy was escorted out in his pajamas, the president of the leader of that country. I guess the point I'm making here is Pompeo making this particular argument that a regional power, or for that matter, a global power, especially with the economic dominance of China, doesn't have domain over the areas pertaining to China is utterly, entirely, outright, not just outlandish, but just ludicrous. And yet, here we are, asserting domain over the world. Shane, how weird is this? Or do you even think this is weird at all? Should the U.S. have a certain degree of domain over areas that don't necessarily pertain to the United States? It should other countries have certain rule sets that the United States apparently does not ascribe to itself?
Well, we've had it for a while, so it seems pretty right to us. You know, since the end of World War II or whenever, we've kind of been the big guy with the big stick around the world. And so just surely due to commitment to that policy and all of the habits that we form in relation to that, including the mental habits, it's not weird. It's not controversial. It's not counterintuitive. But it also isn't controversial for China to be pushing for this. What's interesting here, I mean, there was a dispute between the Philippines and China back in 2016 over this. I mean, it's an ongoing thing. There's a court that ruled basically against China in this case. I'll note, they were talking about the coral reefs. It seems like there were sort of economic and ecological interests also at play in terms of them dismissing China's historical claims to the Spratly Islands. This is something I've been watching for a few years. It's interesting. I have to admit, my bias comes out here. I like China's building these artificial platforms. I really like the idea of these like larger scale industrial projects, as crazy as that may sound from the ecological perspective.
I'm a sucker for it. I am a sucker for it.
You do that kind of big thing, you do it well, and you do it, with an eye on the ecology, making sure that you're not doing too much harm, ideally minimizing that harm as much as possible. That whole thing, that's so cool. And so from that, I have that bias going into this, but it's also not my freaking business. You know what I mean? It's on the other side of the world. Exactly. I understand why the United States is pushing, because we're seen as this sort of big other player in the arena. And so from the perspective of the UN or these various intra-governmental agencies, world agencies effectively, who are responsible for administering this stuff and giving at least de jure rulings on what's going to be permissible. I understand why the role we play in that context, but there's also this question of whether we should be playing that role, whether there should be anybody who plays that role, whether there should be any world intermediary or mediator for geopolitical and military conflict. That's a whole other can of worms, and I think that's the sort of foundational one that you have to talk about. With this specific issue, though, it doesn't surprise me at all. This is exactly what you'd expect to happen. China would push for more power. We try to keep them fenced in,
Well, and that's a problem, though, right? I mean, just the very fact that your country ends up with a point of view that says this is okay. Like, honestly, the killing of Soleimani was so over the top. Like, it would be like if John Kerry got killed as he went through some kind of, some country or whatever. And this country looks at it and is so accustomed to the United States engaging in this type of militarism abroad that it gives it a fair pass. Well, we have a situation where a power is trying to assert its power in the region. Now, here's the thing. I don't think you're cynical enough. Be more cynical. Now, the reason I say that is because the United States looks at the world in zero-sum terms. It's like if the U.S. was playing chess. And the goal in chess is very clarified. Your goal is to capture the king. Well, there is no king to capture in regards to the world. What you can do is to try to ham up some level of global domination that just kind of exceeds itself in perpetuity. Now, that is an amazing and expansive goal, but that is the goal of the U.S. And everything else from economic or militarist, or for that matter, allegiances or alliances will be used in that pursuit. And so if China is trying to gain some level of economic strength and trying to expand, by definition almost, the United States is going to take a position to try to stop that, because that would intercede upon its ability to have some level of global domination. If that gets to little platforms that hide and just float in the sky, that can drop ballistic weapons or ballistic things on various countries when those countries get out of hand, then we will do that. If that's some kind of space domination, we will do that. Other countries, if they're not looking at the world in these terms, are going to not understand why and how the U.S. is acting in this way. I mean, look at what we do with foreign policy. We basically see something that we want around the world. If it's a country that's not our ally, we turn around and say that that country is somehow doing some kind of humanitarian thing wrong, and use that as a reason to put economic and political pressure on it, with our lapdog nations in the UK or in Europe backing us up on it. And this is for Venezuela, this is for Iran, this is for Russia, this is for China, this is for any country in South America, even somewhere like Bolivia, where the guy had brought up all of this poverty, had health care, had brought the indigenous community in line into the government. None of this mattered, because at the end of the day, how well you do for your country is less relevant than whether or not we have domination and control. And it doesn't matter if it is in our hemisphere of the world. It doesn't matter if it's in South America. For that matter, it doesn't even matter if it's in the area of Russia or China. And that's always brings us into conflict, because other countries have the very right to assert that they want to have their independence. And so it's like you have this constant thing in our world of a conflict that is irreconcilable based on the ideology of the predominant nation that's running it. That's unfortunate, but it's true. We don't like to accept that, because to us, that's too much. But it's true. It's indicative of the way we do our foreign policy. And the way, like, to me, this makes sense under chess logic. Maybe there's another logic for it, but I don't see another one for it.
Oh yeah, I mean, so two things I want to hit on here before we go into the break. One is the zero-sum aspect, and one is you didn't say the word, I don't think, but it kind of applies this idea of hegemony, or the idea that the U.S. has been the hegemon for a while. A lot of people who are looking at China, as far as I can tell, China has a fairly clearly stipulated ideological perspective. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, Xi Jinping thought, it's all out there. Anybody can go and read it. And as far as I can tell, it's been pretty continuous. There have been subtle variations over the last couple of years, but for the most part, it's been steady. There are questions about how well that will be maintained through future rulers' leadership. After Xi Jinping dies or steps down or is removed or whatever the case may be, how well that lineage continues. So in other words, how well you can use the policies he's laid out to predict what China is going to do. Arguably, if he does a good job at sort of maintaining his power base, you can use that pretty reliably, because that sets the direction for the country. Now, here's what I'm leading up to. If you look at the policies, it doesn't seem like China's trying to be the hegemon. It seems like they're trying to be a major power. From their perspective, the most powerful power, arguably, probably, just because that makes sense for them to want. But it seems like what their goal is to have power and to maintain that power in the region, not around the world. And therefore, for people who are looking at the shape of things, who are looking at the sort of balance of possibilities, the scales of justice, but also the scales of just how things are going to go, where things are going to head, I understand why they're pretty cautious about the U.S. and a lot of people, at least a lot of nations and statespeople, why they're cautious about the U.S. and they're a little bit more optimistic potentially about China. Not only have we been decaying and failing for a little while, but we also have this sort of totalitarian view in the world and this totalitarian stance that we take around the world. And that's one issue. There's this other thing that maybe we should close out and we can come back on, or we can turn to something else too. It's this idea, you said the phrase zero sum, that we view, Pompeo specifically views the world through a zero sum lens. Arguably, we sort of created that nest for ourselves. A lot of the conversations we've been having about economic issues particularly relate to decisions that we made in the wake of World War II, when we sort of moved into this stance of ease, where, again, we're the world's strongest economic power, the world's strongest military power. We're the strongest power in the world, bar none. And because of that, that set in place various processes, psychological, institutional, economical, that that led us to this weird complacency. And that complacency arguably created these economic problems that we're still living in, sort of hiding from. And arguably, those economic problems leave us in a very real sense in a zero-sum world. So I'm pushing back in a weird way because I think he has reason to think that. But what you'd hope for is leadership, again, from the world's strongest power. You'd hope that they would have some leadership that can get us back to a positive sum world. And as far as I can tell, for decades, what they've tried has failed. So I don't know that I can trust them. With that, we've extended our time. We're going to go into a break right now. I'm pushing a little bit past the limit, but thank you for listening to me rattle on. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You are listening to the most disruptive show in American radio, Fault Lines, with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. I am Shane Stranahan, and I am joined by my great co-host, Jamarl Thomas. Jamarl, I hear you're on. Say hi so people can hear your voice, please.
What's happening, everybody?
Thank you. That was awesome. Anyway, as for new listeners, those are the voices and the names. That's why I'm doing that thing. Anyway, we're going into a taking calls segment. So we are taking your calls. You can call in with a phone at the phone number 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-521-1320. Taking calls this segment. What do you think, Jamarl? You want to keep talking about the Spratly Island stuff? Or I want to go back?
Yeah. I want to talk about the China thing for just for a moment, and then I want to move to the Washington Redskin thing if we have time. What China wants may not actually matter in real terms. Even what Xi Jinping wants, even if he had the best of ideas, even if in his head, I am going to get China to an economically dominant position and increase the wealth of the various population and then hand it over and to come up with this notion of communism where we could smash the government in the world. Even if he wanted that, meaning even if he had these utopian prospects, at the end of the day, he is limited and constrained by a world to which he finds himself. And if that world is hostile, he has to take actions to deal with that. If we're playing a game, if you're not playing Civilization, and I decide I want to have an economic country, I want to be this kind of kumbaya, I want all of my people to be artists and whatnot, I'm going to be conquered. I promise you, it is exactly going to happen because not every country in the world is going to have your point of view of the world. And your point of view has to some degree, concede itself almost to other points of view if those points of view clash with your own. Meaning if the U.S. is going to take a turner around the world, that it is going to be the hegemonic force, the dominant perspective and the dominant military and economic might, and you're doing something that go against that, you are going to have problems by definition. And those problems are going to have to be things that you reconcile as you grow and develop. If not to avoid war, at one point, but also to avoid your country to be toppled. Now, keep in mind, China also has this aspect to it of understanding what happened in Hong Kong, with the Brits forcing open the country, with the Brits ripping away Hong Kong and because it wouldn't allow it to sell opium that basically undermined and destroyed that particular empire. I'm making the point that those are cultural memories that are built into that country that they are perfectly and entirely aware of. So regardless of whatever they want, if we even postulate that they had the best interests in this kind of grand, expansive, utopian perspective of the world, the economic might of itself, of China, will generate an aura of power. How could it not? If you think about the United States and what its strong suit was, it wasn't involved in those wars where we lost a lot of life, but also we were able to generate massive amounts of economic might. I mean, we were building a military that was something that the world hadn't seen before, while simultaneously arming the Soviet Union, Britain, and France to fight the Nazis. If you read Speer's book, you get the notion of how dominant the U.S. was in regards to the weapons and whatnot it was putting out, and how Speer at some point realized we are screwed. There's no capacity for us to match not just the might of the U.S. by itself, because of how phenomenal it was and dominant it was of economic output and of machine and military and material output. But the moment that a country gets to that point, that country becomes a power by definition. And so it's like whatever China wants, and I suspect it wants what most nations wants, especially when it considers itself a power of sorts and a power that should be regarded by the rest of the world as such, almost as a sign of respect. Well, that will come into conflict with our basic point of view of the world. And whether that's a Democrat or whether that's a Republican, every bit as much as the British had this idea that we are, the white man's burden, or that we are holding up the world as an exceptional nation. And the United States has that. And it also gets into the mindset and soaks into the particular leaders who are in our country, Democrat or Republican. I do not know how to get rid of that point of view. And I also don't know how that point of view doesn't lead to larger conflicts.
I've got a perspective on this.
Oh, go ahead. Well, no, go for it, Shane.
Let's do it real quick, and then I want to get to Rod, because I see Rod from Philly too. We'll be with you in just a second, Rod. Here's my take on this, and this is why I don't like freaking ideology in general. It's another conversation we've had before, maybe sometime later, because again, that'd turn into its own thing. We've got to go to Rod. But here's the deal. You look around the world right now. You look around the last 75 years. Again, this post-World War II era. It was founded on this principle of liberal democracy, which became an ideology in contrast to fascism and Marxism or communism at the time, socialism now. It's more widely known as. So this is an ideological struggle. And what that means is it's attached to a political wing that's going to try to enact that ideological view of the world, as all of these things were. Now, as far as I can tell, the sort of liberal democratic side, not the set of ideas which have largely been betrayed, and that's the point, but the side won. You had this side. It attained for this period of time hegemony. It attained supreme control. Basically, it was able to basically do what it wanted. It starved out its main opponent, the Soviet Union. And then for the last 20, 30 some odd years, that side won. Now, what I don't like about ideology is that I really like ideas, and I really think that they're incredibly important. But when you have this superstructure that ties ideas and politics into some one cohesive unity, and that ties the public, this massive sort of nominal participants in the political sphere, when it ties them up on it too, it so dilutes the ethical meaning of our ideas, because you're having to betray them necessarily. You're having to betray your convictions, and you're inevitably betraying them as you try to enact them over time. That I don't think that's unique to liberal democracy. This is a larger conversation, possibly. I think this is a fundamental constraint of ideology. And it's because I like the ideas, and I think that we need to analyze them dispassionately in order to have the best fruits from them, that I so don't like this process of ideologizing your ideas. And this ties into the cancel culture stuff in a weird way. Maybe we can come back to that later. But with my little thing out of the way, let's go to Rod. Rod from Philly, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, good morning, guys. I wanted to talk about the lockdowns that's coming down in California and how the coronavirus is being used. I know we affirmed that that people are using the coronavirus politically, but it's kind of really messed up as far as how the California governor is ensuring another lockdown. I mean, he's kind of playing the parent role and telling people that they didn't wear masks enough, they didn't do what they were told enough. So the only consequence that he can put on people is to lock down again. That's very dictatorish. And as far as for economic reasons, for people who, as far as working or have businesses, I mean, we already know that half of businesses aren't coming back, or restaurants and things of that sort are not coming back, no matter how much they want to. And for him to put another lockdown on the whole state like that, it's real crazy. And we see how it's just a political ploy now. It's not really about safety anymore.
Real quick, just a quick question. What is the governor, who has a philosophical responsibility to ensure life and limb in regards to California, what is he supposed to do in this situation?
Well, see, I'm not saying you, for him to say, or for any politician to say, well, you have to lock you down and you can't leave your house, or you can't go to any type of these businesses that he shut down, and saying that
wait, real quick. You can go anywhere out your house, but business gets into the very act and fact that a business exists at all is a legal fiction. It has something to do under that point, under the auspices of law. I mean, the very fact that an African American can go into a business became a fact of law when they opened up those businesses. It gives some notion that the government does have some responsibility to ensure that if people are going into a shop or a business, that those people are safe. And it became dramatically unsafe when they started opening those businesses up and they saw the numbers starting to skyrocket. Does he not have a responsibility to ensure that the numbers for COVID-19 don't spike as a result of public policy?
Well, Jamal, I believe we're missing each other on the point of when you say the numbers spiked. Listen, I worked in medicine for 8 years personally as a first responder, and I still work in the medical field on the other side where I see people's medical records and other information that I would never ever share. But I'm just saying, as far as when people say, "Oh, the numbers spiked," listen, the testing it's very, very faulty. The coronavirus is a family of viruses, so you can test positive, but nobody's ever come out clearly and said, what does that mean? Well, they say, well, you're asymptomatic. Well, there's a lot of people that are tested asymptomatic, and we're not having the illnesses or the deaths that they will proclaim that we should be having or they expected us to have. Now they say,
but that's not entirely true. Wait. The number of deaths. What? Just let me say one thing. The ICUs in many of these states have started to fill up, whether you're talking about Florida, whether you talk about Arizona. Arizona has requested additional refrigeration trucks because of the number of deaths that had been taking place. And so it's not just testing. I mean, whether you're talking about Florida, whether you're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, Georgia, I could be wrong on Georgia. If you're talking about Arizona, if you're talking about California, you are seeing an uptick in the, Texas was the other one. And the number of people who are either in ICU. Here. Go for it, Shane.
So I'm out in Southern California right now. Technically, I'm outside of Los Angeles, but I'm in the area. I'm staying with a good friend, and he was telling me, I'm not going to get into the details because, personal stuff, but he was telling me about his mom, who's a nurse at a hospital in Burbank, California. I'm not going to say where, but, only so many. But regardless, she's a nurse at the hospital. She's been working as a nurse there for years. Obviously during the whole COVID pandemic. She's saying that just in the last week, they're seeing more cases than they ever saw during the initial peak of the coronavirus epidemic. So they're at full capacity at this point. Like literally yesterday when they were talking, she said to him that they were at full capacity, that they don't have any ventilators, that she hasn't seen anything like this. That's anecdotal. And I also want to throw this in there before I pass it back over to you, Jamarl. I also am very cautious about a lot of the new confirmed cases because not only are the tests faulty, but a lot of it doesn't make sense, frankly. And there are different things that might make it make sense if we knew them. There's stuff that you can test for in your testing. It could be that we're looking at things on a countrywide basis, not nearly closely enough on a statewide basis, and that's causing us statistically to lump things together in different confusing ways. It could be that the virus is mutated, as a lot of people have said. It could be that a lot of the tests are faulty, like you were saying, or that we're using too many different kinds of tests, and a lot of the ones that we're using most are faulty. And I agree with you. A lot of this stuff is very unclear, but just from my personal anecdotal experience from hearing about this, I'm seeing in California, the state that sort of triggered this conversation, I'm seeing that uptick in not just cases, but in hospitalizations. And therefore, pretty soon, sadly, that'll probably be an uptick in deaths too.
I guarantee you, Newsom is not shutting the government down or the economy down because he wants to. And from the standpoint of even in Maryland, Larry Hogan comes out and says this virus is out of control. My wife, her mom, works in a surgical thing where they are being given governance, basically saying where she's concerned about her own life. I, as somebody who has deal with kidney failure, there are certain comorbidities that make this that much more dangerous in the case of people who are engaging it. I'll tell you from my own personal experience. Last week, I had to go and get a catheter put in. I hate catheters. The last one I had was 20-something years ago. It is an extremely painful process where your doctor stands over you, inserts a rod into an artery, expands it again by shoving it in until they get something in that they can access your blood. This is not something that I wanted. And when I sat in a room because my fistula stopped working, and the guy told me, I sat there for a while trying to reconcile the fact that I don't have a choice in doing this, or that my choice and the other side of that choice is so monstrous that it just becomes somewhat of a non-factor. In which case, you have to acquiesce and say, yes, it's not something that I want, it's just something that a requirement. He's not shutting them down for his health. He's shutting them down for other people's health. And personally, I don't have an issue with that. I do appreciate the call, Rod. Definitely call back so we can have a back and forth at it. Let's wrap this on this one, though. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back with Gareth Porter talking about the Pentagon selling the fake Bountygate story. Like, share. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my disembodied co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you from our station out of D.C. If you guys live in the area and you want to catch us on radio, you could do so at 105.5 FM, or for that matter, 1390 AM. If you are in the Kansas City area, we are also kicking it there at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give up the like, give up the share. You can also join this conversation by sending a chat, a tweet, and of course, a call. 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. We've had some great calls. Rod, thank you for calling in. This show is Fault Lines, so the disagreement is just kind of part and parcel to what we are. We enjoy the call, so definitely don't let disagreement be a reason for you not to call in. In fact, you may even have it be an impetus to call in. But right now, we're joined by investigative reporter, author, and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy, Gareth Porter. Gareth, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Glad to be on.
Absolutely. We're glad to have you. So, Donald Trump, once again, tries to extricate troops from a particular area or forge some kind of peaceful relations, whether that is in Syria, whether that is in North Korea, and right now it is in Afghanistan as he's trying to fulfill a campaign promise of extricating those troops out of the area. Now, immediately, almost on cue, a story descends from the heavens from random intelligence agents that is basically uncorroborated, and that everybody that was involved in the Taliban, including Russia and Donald Trump, and even people who were affiliated with Donald Trump, has basically said this story didn't happen. Nevertheless, New York Times runs with it, and the mainstream media, who loves these Tom Clancy-esque type stories without giving any sort of context or anything else, runs with it. Now, what is the reality of the story? How did the story evolve or come about? And is there an underlying reality of truth to this particular story?
Well, as you introduced the story, I think quite correctly, this story really is about, in its origins, the Trump administration, President Trump himself, wanting to get out of Afghanistan fully and finally, withdrawing all U.S. troops, hopefully by the time of the election, which is the obvious motivation that he has here. And there's no question in my mind that the timing of this story and the events surrounding it were indeed determined by that reality, that the Afghan government and the Pentagon and the CIA, to some extent, faced this reality that unless something was done, Trump was very likely to insist on getting U.S. troops out of there, announcing that U.S. troops were getting out by the time of the elections in 2020. And so what happened was that the Afghan government, specifically the Afghan intelligence agency, the NDS, the dreaded NDS, which is very well known for the use of torture against detainees. United Nations has documented this over and over again up until last year. They were still documenting it.
the NDS came up with this scheme of making some arrests of people who have been identified by the Times as businessmen, one businessman in particular, who had done business in or with Russia and had been a small-time drug runner at earlier stages of his life, and then made huge amounts of money with the U.S. Mission in Afghanistan, building roads and getting very lucrative contracts. He was one of the people who was arrested and identified, and they claimed that this guy was serving as an intermediary for the Russians to give bounties, offering bounties to people who were somehow not very well identified. They call them criminals and militants, to carry out the killing of American troops in Afghanistan. That's really how it started. We don't have time to get into the details of this, but what happened was that the Afghan intelligence agency, of course, passed on, it interrogated these people that he detained, and either by using coercion, by basically beating them up sufficiently, torturing them, extracted false confessions from people saying that they had in fact done this. They had served as intermediaries for the Russians with regard to this Bounty Gate affair, and that those interrogation reports then were passed on to the U.S. government. It was originally the CIA station in Kabul that was the main transmission belt for this report. And then it went to the Pentagon and other agencies in Washington, and it generated the story leaked to the New York Times, which I have described the reality of, but which, of course, was presented as this is evidence that the Russians have carried out this scheme to give bounties to Afghans to kill Americans. The short end of the story is that ultimately, the denouement is that ultimately the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, all gave this, lower than passing grades in terms of its credibility. Either medium confidence, which actually means low confidence if you examine the way that the term is actually used in the intelligence community, or low confidence, which means no confidence. So, that's really the ultimate scandal of this story, that the intelligence community didn't accept it. The Times knows this. New York Times, which is the main creator of the story in terms of publishing it, knows this very well because they published that fact. But they continue to act as though it was real, that this actually happened, the way the Pentagon and their anonymous or their unidentified sources are describing the story.
And unfortunately, we have this weird situation where the American public comes away with the majority opinion that this story is legit, not necessarily going into details. I mean,
Right.
the overwhelming majority of people just read the headlines. This also doesn't really give context. Good. I'm sorry. I was just saying it doesn't give context either to the U.S. actions. Meaning, even if the story was true in and of itself, it doesn't really give context to U.S. actions in Afghanistan, or for that reason, or for that matter, in the Middle East, in regards to our own propensity to, let's say, pay one group in order to attack another group. What is the reasoning for this?
You're right. You're right, but let me just point out that it's absolutely untrue that the Russians have any real motive to do what was talked about in this story. In fact, their concern in Afghanistan is not to kill Americans; it's to try to avoid the impact of extreme Islamism in Afghanistan on Russia itself and on the countries with very large majority Islamic populations abutting Russia. And in that regard, I mean, yes, they probably did in fact cooperate with the Taliban, rightly so, because the Taliban, in fact, was fighting the Islamic State in northern Afghanistan and in eastern Afghanistan, so and western as well. So definitely the Russians did have relations with the Taliban, and they may have, in fact, given some money to the Taliban. I'm not sure, but if they did, it would not have been to kill Americans. It would have been to help provide intelligence on extremist Islam and to for other purposes that served their main interest there.
It also need to be noted that the Taliban had stopped killing Americans because they wanted America to leave. And meaning everybody who was in that region who had anything to do with that region, basically, with the exception of maybe the Afghan intelligence or the Afghan government, wanted the U.S. to leave, in which case the whole notion of killing Americans kind of became non-existent almost.
Well, that's
right.
Also true, correct? They're not even claiming that the Taliban did this. They're not claiming that the Taliban did this in 2020 after the signing of the agreement. They're talking about this happening in 2019 and before that even. So, I mean, it's a tall tale. There's no doubt about that. And it doesn't hold up for many reasons, which I've talked about in more detail in my piece.
Why does the New York Times push a story like this? Is it purely for fiscal reasons, or is there an ideological point of view on this that pushes them to basically push a story that, I have to be honest, is at this point discredited? I mean, even the people who are associated with, like, the Pentagon came out saying, we don't know that the story is true. So what's New York Times motive?
The Times, like any other newspaper, a major newspaper or electronic news outlet, is looking for viewers and readers, and this is a way of doing it. They really piled it on. They, day after day for like more than a week, they wrote stories about this. No doubt that was part of it, but at the same time, you have to recognize the Times, like other major corporate news outlets, has an umbilical cord tying into the national security state. They always have. Going back to the early days of the Cold War, they had people who used to work undercover for the CIA, and that's just the beginning of the story of the complicity of the corporate media with the intelligence agencies and the Pentagon for many decades now. So you can't decide that it's one or the other. It's both of them.
Very cool. Very interesting. One more question before we end the break. We have about 2.5 minutes left. I'm curious about this because I'm curious about just the way the foreign politics or politics itself kind of propagates itself. Is Afghanistan, is there issue and is there impetus in working with something like this out of concern that the state would fall to the Taliban if the United States leaves? This is somewhat a relevant point to me. What happens in Afghanistan is Afghanistan's issue. But is that part and parcel to their reasoning for putting out something like this in order to provoke Trump from keeping the men from their side of the equation?
Well, now, if we're talking now about the Pentagon and the CIA, the stake that they have in this is definitely that they want the war to go on forever. I mean, not forever, literally, but as long as they can keep it going. Why? Because the war in Afghanistan is, of course, the longest war in American history, and there's a good reason for that, because it generates all kinds of benefits to the military-industrial congressional complex. The drone operators, of course, have a huge stake because most of the bombing, all the bombing practically now that goes on in Afghanistan is by drones, and that's a hugely lucrative business for people in the drone industry, and for people who will go from the Pentagon into the drone industry, that's a factor. There's huge contracts to be had by military contractors and others, and people in the Pentagon who are thinking about their retirement don't want to reduce the number of options that they have. So that's one thing. It also means more promotions within the military. That's being on active duty in a war is the way you get promotions, and so they want to keep that thing going. The CIA has had a rising role in Afghanistan, carrying out covert operations for the past year and a half, and they want to keep that going as well for similar reasons. So it's really a bureaucratic interest that both the CIA and even more so the Pentagon have in keeping this war going. That's the problem we're up against.
That is the voice of Gareth Porter. I really like, by the way, military-industrial congressional complex. I'd heard that, I think, before, maybe, but I'm honestly not sure. This might be the first time. That is great. That's very concise, and that ties that all in. Regardless, we will be back with Gareth in just a minute. He is an investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy. Until then, until a minute from now, you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan.
Fault lines.
Empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening again to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined by Gareth Porter. He is an investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy. He and Jamarl were just having a conversation about these fake bounty gate story, basically, with Russia supposedly paying bounties to the Taliban, which wouldn't make sense. They were covering that. We're actually turning topics slightly, talking about the Iran and China deal. It's basically a security deal, secretive deal. I haven't heard that much about it. It was first written about, as far as I can tell, within the past few weeks when they were negotiating this. And we have some of the details. It ties into their Belt and Road program, China's Belt and Road program, Iran, obviously central position strategically in terms of trade, in terms of their position on the sea. There's a lot, though, that I don't know about this. What do you know about this, Gareth? What should we know about this?
Well, there is a lot that all of us don't know about it because the text. There is a text that's circulating around the internet or around the world that has not been published, to my knowledge, yet. Although I would not be surprised if we don't see it in the very very near future, in the next few days. But it's a very highly significant agreement, which has not been signed. That's the first point that really needs to be registered here. It has not been signed, but it has been in the works for well over a year, in the sense that there have been reports, not just in recent days, but actually more than a year ago or about a year ago, there was the first detailed report on this still unsigned agreement. And it's strategically highly important because it would give Iran, assuming that this goes through, and I have every reason to believe it will, it gives Iran an option that allows it to thumb its nose at the pressure from the United States to a great extent, in the sense that they have this source of investment that would be assured under the agreement from China for its oil, gas, and petrochemical sector, as well as other sectors of their economy, particularly the manufacturing sector, where they are very much in need of foreign support, foreign investment. And of course, the United States, by punishing all foreign investments in Europe or companies that might invest in Europe and elsewhere in the world, have essentially denied them the ability to get foreign investment, while at the same time denying them the ability to sell their oil to their regular customers, including, by the way, China, which in the past has reduced their buying of oil from Iran very substantially. But what this would do is to give Iran a source of capital that would allow it to be free of that pressure from the United States. And I think that is really the main reason that the Iranians decided to sign this very long-term, this 25-year cooperation agreement. It's called a strategic partnership with China. And by the way, it also includes military cooperation with China. And there are reports that seem quite reliable that this is in the context of understandings between China and Russia, that the Russians will become part of that military cooperation as well. They will be available to come into a conflict should there be the need to help Iran by sending planes, by sending ships to an Iranian port or to Iranian air bases. So this is highly significant strategically. It really does, in a way, checkmate the United States and its European allies and allows Iran to say, okay, you've done your thing, but we're still standing and you're not going to be able to bring us down.
Now, it became clear that Obama was pushing for the Trans-Pacific Partnership as this kind of end run around China. Basically, they looked at China as being an issue from an economic standpoint, and they were looking for ways to try to cow or to hobble the government. And so the Trans-Pacific Partnership was one of the ways they were going to do that, basically create an economic relationship with like 40% of the globe or something. So this is a rational act by Iran and China to work in their coordination. And for that matter, if it includes Russia, North Korea, you can even conceivably include Turkey on some level. This creates two world orders from an economic standpoint. What are your expectations with this? I mean, if Biden wins the presidency, he seems to continue to push the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whereas China is pushing for the Belt and Road Initiative. What does this look like in a couple of years? If you had to put on your prognostication hat, and let's say both of these governments get exactly what they want, that they get the organization of people behind their own banner of economic relief, while simultaneously the United States tries to get its own 40% or whatever the world's population behind its economic support system.
Well, that's a very complicated question, and I am not a specialist on global economy. What I can say is that Joe Biden, if elected, will certainly predictably carry out a similar policy as that of the Obama administration, and will continue the sort of Cold War against China, which has been ginned up over the last couple of years and has become the primary theme of the U.S. military-industrial congressional complex. I mean, it is primarily now a Cold War with China rather than a Cold War with Russia. That is, making the pulses race in Washington, D.C. in these quarters. So, we know that there will be continued a sense of high level of conflict between the United States and China, which will have both economic and military implications. And this will play into that, no doubt about it, because the United States is going to be very unhappy about the Chinese strategic coup, if you will, of reaching agreement with Iran.
So I want to bring in some facts here. I've been reading a little bit about this. Some of the numbers first. China will be investing about $280 billion in Iran in developing the country's oil, gas, and petrochemical sectors. This is what you were talking about earlier. That's the number, though. And again, that's not trillions, but that's hefty. There will be another $120 billion invested for upgrading Iran's transport and manufacturing infrastructure. Again, that fits into the One Belt, One Road initiative's sort of general policy here, building infrastructure, building these trade programs, setting things up so that you can have these flows of investment like we're seeing. China's also going to get a pretty hefty discount when they're buying back oil, gas, and petrochemicals. That's going to be a couple of discounts piled together that when they get piled together, including foreign exchange rates in terms of the currencies, a guaranteed discount. It's going to be done on a sort of rolling basis. Anyway, it's about a 30% discount. So from China's perspective, I can understand.
Yeah, almost one-third, exactly, one-third discount. And let me just add to what you just said, that highly significant aspect of this is that it is front-loaded in the first 5 years of the 25-year long partnership. So they're going to see the benefits. The Iranians will see the benefits coming very quickly, and it will be very much in the next few years that they will get the bulk of the economic benefit from these investments. And so that's very important. And I would just add that this option on the Iranian side of relying on the Chinese and the Russians, in this case, primarily, of course, the Chinese, has been the primary choice, a strategic choice of the most ardent nationalists in Iran for many years now. The people who are strong supporters of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the people who take the hard line in foreign policy toward the United States and Europe, have wanted Iran to take this course strategically for many years, and has been resisted by Rouhani and others in the more centrist, moderate part of the political spectrum for all those years. And I think this is highly significant for that reason, because it represents a very large shift in the fundamental orientation of Iranian foreign policy, and suggests that the right wing of Iranian politics has grown much stronger over the last few years, primarily because of pressure from the United States and Europe.
I'm curious, why was Rouhani against this? This seems like the most rational action in the world.
Well, Rouhani was against it because he has been part of a faction of Iranian politics which was very ardently hoping to join the global capitalist system, which meant, in fact, to net its relations politically with the United States and Europe, and to get U.S. and European technology and investment. So this is really a big blow to that whole way of thinking, which has been animating Iranian foreign policy really all the way going back to the early 1980s when the Islamic Republic was just beginning.
One last follow-up here I want to bring up. We were talking about the economic side, the flows of investment, again, also the Chinese discounts on oil they'd be importing from Iran through this deal. We didn't talk about the military side. As far as I can tell, it's mainly focusing on air bases, where they're talking about building dual-use facilities next to existing airports in, I believe they mentioned, four regions. From what you've seen, I'm probably missing some stuff. That seems to be about the extent of the military engagement, at least from the surface of this iceberg that we're seeing.
Well, the agreement itself does refer, I can tell you this, it does refer to naval cooperation as well. So, I mean, there is an anticipation that there will be arrangements made to have Chinese ships visiting, military ships visiting Iranian ports. And that's all I can tell you about the specifics on that.
Thank you for filling that in. A quick question also sort of related. You and John Kiriakou wrote a book together, The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis, From CIA Coup to the Brink of War. I'm curious, we only have about a minute left. Where would you go if you wanted to learn more about the history of Iran? Any books or sources or journals or newspapers that you tend to read, media sources in general? Where would you go to really get the facts about the history of Iran from the beginning, of the 20th century up to now?
Yeah, we have in our book a very long section, not a long section, but a very substantive section on the Iranian experience in dealing with Western, both Russian and British imperialism, and then their encounter with the United States. So, I mean, I would recommend highly that book as a good reference tool that gives you the story of the historical background of Iran's encounter with imperialism.
Okay, very good. Glenn, the name of the book, The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis, From CIA Coup to the Brink of War. And again, that was Gareth Porter, co-authored with John Kiriakou over at Loud and Clear, also on Radio Sputnik. So full disclosure for people, that's there. Thank you so much for joining us, Gareth.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, hopefully we can have you on again soon. For everybody who's been listening, you've been listening to the voice of Gareth Porter. He is an investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy. Also, if you want to follow him on Twitter specifically, you can. He's Gareth Porter, so it's spelled GarethPorter. That's his username. There we go. All right, got another hour coming up. In this next hour at 9:30, we're going to be talking to David Lugo. This is kind of an extension of the conversation we had yesterday with Tyler P. Nixon. We were talking about Roger Stone, Randy Credico. We briefly mentioned Steve Bannon, didn't really get into that too much. The Credico dog situation, where anyway, get back into that a little bit later with David Lugo, who's a producer, writer, and director. Another great hour coming up. You're listening to the most disruptive show on American radio. It's Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Thomas.
And all right, getting back into top headlines here. We do this 3 times during the course of the show, once at 7, once at 8, and once at 9 Eastern, all 9 a.m. Eastern. Anyway, going back into headlines. The Trump administration has released details on the executive order commuting the sentence of Roger Stone. This comes at the request of Amy Berman Jackson, the judge who presided in Stone's criminal case. Stone, longtime associate apparently of not necessarily Trump, but the wider right-wing movement, libertarian himself, known as a political operative, sometimes described as a self-described dirty trickster, although I haven't heard him describe himself as a dirty trickster. That might be an aside. Regardless, this follows a little bit of a fracas on Friday and over the weekend. Earlier, the judge had denied Stone's request to delay his admittance to the prison. Then Trump came out and commuted him. Then yesterday, the judge, Amy Berman Jackson, again, was calling for details on that commutation. Trump released those details. Turns out he's commuting everything, basically. The 3 years and 4 months of Stone's prison sentence, the 2 years of his supervised release, which would have followed the prison sentence, and the administration also remitted any unpaid remainder of a $20,000 fine levied on Stone as a part of his conviction. In our next story, China's embassy in Washington says the United States is trying to sabotage regional peace in the South China Sea. This follows recent comments from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in which he said that China's pursuit of offshore resources in the vicinity of the Spratly Islands is, quote, completely unlawful, end quote, and that, quote, the world will not allow Beijing to treat the South China Sea as its maritime empire, end quote. China's embassy said the U.S., quote, deliberately distorts facts and international law, end quote. That was on Twitter, by the way. You can go check that out. That's the Chinese embassy's account to the U.S. In our next story, California is closing down a wide array of indoor entertainment facilities. Those include its bars, restaurants, bowling alleys, gyms, hair salons, wineries. They're also closing down places of worship. This follows an order from Governor Gavin Newsom last night. New Mexico, I'll also note, New Mexico is not as widely noted in terms of its the number of people living in it, and therefore, in some sense, how strongly we should be focusing on it as a state. As for at least that's what I'm going to assume here. This kind of thing is a little bit weird to talk about. New Mexico seems to be having a pretty big surge in cases too. They're also re-implementing a lockdown, but I haven't heard about them nearly as much as I've heard about California. Just looking around, so I'm throwing them in there. They're also doing this lockdown. Why is another matter. Florida has had more than 27,000 new cases in a period of just 2 days. Again, in just 2 days, you might have remembered 15,299 was the count for one day. That would have been about a little bit less than 12,000, about 12,000 the next day. In any event, that would make it, if it were a country, it would be in the 4th place in the world for reporting new coronavirus cases. So it would be in the 4th place in terms of how many new cases it has. But it would be in 10th place in the world for the total number of cases. For me, that's actually a bit more significant. And if you made Florida a country, it would be in the 10th place around the world for the number of people there with coronavirus cases. Of course, Florida is not a country, it's a state. And so that's all the more remarkable for a portion of our country to be so high up on that list. One last note here on the COVID stuff. Coronavirus Task Force leader Anthony Fauci has said he is, quote, cautiously optimistic that at the end of the year, the beginning of this coming 2021, we will have more than one vaccine that would be available, end quote. No comment on that from me. The state of North Dakota is asking a federal appeals court to block a federal judge's order to shut down the Dakota Access Pipeline. The state is trying to keep the pipeline operational while the company, Energy Transfer, appeals the shutdown order. This comes after last week a federal judge ordered the pipeline to be shut down by August 5th to allow for additional environmental assessment. The United Kingdom is set to ban Huawei from its 5G plans. This follows a January decision by Boris Johnson to allow the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer to sell its products for use in the country. This it seems like a strategic move. I'm also seeing China pushing back. That's coming out this morning. Hope to have more on that in the next segment. Maybe we can come back to that a little bit. In our last story, Washington's NFL team, the Redskins, is dropping its name and logo today in exchange for another name and another logo, which have not yet been revealed to the public. Some names that have been bandied about as replacements include, I'm going to do these in order, there are 4 of them, the Washington Warriors, the Washington Red Tails, the Washington Red Wolves, or the Washington Hogs, maybe the Red Hawks. People were throwing that sub-alternative out there. Well, we'll see what happens with it. You've been listening to the headlines. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. All right, so I suppose we can take calls this and the next segment if you're down, Jamarl. That cool with you?
Absolutely. Always.
Let's do it. All right. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. That's 202-521-1320. And there we go. Yeah, I want to look into this. The thing with the UK banning Huawei, which it seems like they're going to do, and China's responding is if they're going to do that, and it would make sense that they're going to do that based on the level of conflict and tension that seems to have built specifically in the relationship between the U.S. and China over the last few months. That's going to be significant. That's going to be big. A lot of people, like the UK was sort of, the U.S. saw them at least as thumbing their nose at us in a weird way back in January. I remember that being the sort of coverage back at home, over admitting Huawei into the country. So for them to walk that back, the timing of it is interesting. I want to look into this more. I want to figure out what the justifications are. They've said some of it. Some of it's obvious just strategically. But anyway, what's your take, Jamarl?
I find it really strange. Yeah, I find it really strange. It makes sense in a political sense, where the U.S. and the UK are close allies. But the UK has a higher responsibility to its population. And this just seems like they were going for the deal with Huawei because they didn't have the capability of doing it themselves, which kind of shows that at the very least the predicate, the incipient reason for it, hasn't gone anywhere. And so the question becomes what changed? It seems that what changed was politics. Trump, as you remember, was over the top in regards to going after the UK for with Huawei in general. And the UK has a responsibility, though, to citizens to ensure a certain degree of technological development, or for that matter, a certain degree of development within the society. And if they can't provide it themselves, just from a business standpoint, Huawei seems like a great area. One of the issues, though, that they were dealing with had to do with this notion of security. How do we ensure that the company is secure, that our private communications and everything else aren't necessarily disadvantaged by interacting with Huawei? The reality of it is Huawei made this kind of proclamation that, look, we'll give over our information and we'll sign an affirmative case that we won't intrude upon these communications if the other countries around the world do the same. And as Gareth mentioned in the previous section, the United States and our telecommunications, or for that matter media, has always been fused at the hip. So basically the thing that we're pointing to Huawei is basically the thing that we ourselves are guilty of. The only difference is when we look at Huawei, we consider them to be a foreign actor, and as a foreign actor, untrustworthy, where we accept that our country may listen in and screw around with our communications. It's an interesting case. It's this weird, we do something, we don't want you to do it, and it's okay that we do it because it's within the context of our country or all of us are allies. But the even belief that there's a potential for it is in and of itself enough to scuttle a deal that would have benefited Britain. I think that case is really, really interesting. And it's one thing if they had something to point to.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know that they do. Maybe again, this is national security stuff. I might have misinterpreted what you were saying. I've been reading about that. A lot of this stuff has been coming out while we've been on the show. Digital Secretary Oliver Dowden told the House of Commons basically that the UK's mobile providers are being banned from buying new Huawei 5G equipment. That's coming after the 31st of December. So basically the start of this new year. They must also remove all the Chinese firms' 5G kits from their networks by 2027. So they do this, and then in about the next 6 years, whatever they've purchased, they're going to have to pull out of the system. You brought up the national security angle. That's where the mind immediately goes, because of course that's why we would do these things. That's both the official justification and the sort of inherent reason. You're going to set up these firewalls, not just to sort of a lot of the way that people paint this is isolating citizens from views freely expressed on the internet or from views held by other countries or whatever. That comes up, but it's also just a national security thing. You don't want other countries to be creating the equipment that your people are going to use, or that your governmental officials, for that matter, are going to use, because that does pose national security risk. And I buy into that argument, basically, like that. I admit that as a valid case to make. What makes it hypocritical is that the United States, with the Patriot Act and the NSA and everything that we've done, I mean, heck, the past couple of years, we've seen Snowden, we've seen Assange, all pretty much directly related to the control of information, the abuse of government powers. That more broadly, with Snowden specifically, obviously, it was the NSA spying on us. So it's like this tu quoque thing where I'm not making an argument here, like a logical argument necessarily. What I am saying is, culturally, as people who have to reconcile our actions with our views and how they're hypocritical, we should be thinking about that from the American perspective. But there's this conversation to have about the national security stuff too. That's my take.
You know, I'm talking about Joe Biden. You know what? This election started to remind me of the Bill Clinton election, where Biden is going to appeal to more blue dog Democrats. Some of them probably switched over and voted for Trump. I think Biden will bring some of those voters back in states like Arizona. I think Biden's leading right now in Arizona.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate the call. Yeah, I mean, they are showing that Joe Biden is basically leading in many of these swing states. Look, I think the polls are a two-edged sword. In one case, I do think they give you a snapshot with regard to what's going on in the public and the perspective of that public. And unfortunately, one of the most recent polls show people seeing Joe Biden as being further to the left than what Joe Biden actually, in fact, is, just because of the relation to Trump and the way that the media talks about these issues. But we have about 2 minutes left in the break. Shane, is there anything that I said or that the caller said that you either agree, disagree with, or want to add a response to? My argument was basically that even though it is a military argument to be used here, foreign policy, that this could also boil down to a certain degree of economic dominance, with the United States trying to maintain using military might to do so. In fact, let's take this on the other side of the break. Let's take it a minute earlier. So you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're having a discussion about basically economic and militaristic dominance. You are listening. Fault Lines. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines, live from DC. This is a open call segment. If you guys want to call in, you can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We've been discussing this notion of China expanding and the kind of rational act that takes place in regards to trying to basically be a power in our world and the rationality of expanding. Not to mention the alliances that you make, specifically in this case, the alliance between Iran and the Republic of China. We're also getting into this notion of the UK and how they were rolling back their attempts at opening Huawei and 5G networks, and the potential and the reasoning that the US may get involved in trying to work behind the scenes to curtail that. And I would make the argument it's the same reason they work in order to curtail Russia from getting the gas contract with Germany. We want our countries to basically be the lion's share of the economic output. And if we can't do that just based on competition that we always hear held up by the capitalists, we are willing to do that by political means. And so what do you think about that, Shane? That it may be a fig leaf from the standpoint of politics and from the standpoint of military and our ability to know that Huawei is a safe company. By the same token, there's an element of this wanted for economic domination. And if Huawei, who basically is the leader in 5G technology and even going beyond 5G technology, starts to expand into the various countries, especially countries that we ourselves are allied with, it will diminish and hurt the ability for our companies to be able to compete with a company that has gained this level of dominance, with the military reasoning being just a fig leaf. What do you think about that?
I think there might not even be a fig leaf. Again, with Trump, with the Make America Great Again stuff, he was talking openly about bringing manufacturing home. I was looking just last month, there was a semiconductor manufacturing bill pushed. I think Tom Cotton was the main author, but other people like Chuck Schumer, other people I kind of wouldn't have expected. Based on the co-signers, based on the people pushing this, I kind of don't trust it. But I do like the idea of like doing high-tech manufacturing back in the States instead of relying on cheap and oppressed labor overseas. That seems more ethical in a couple of ways and arguably more sensible too. So from that perspective, it's our prerogative, speaking as an American entity, speaking not as an individual American necessarily, but as America as a whole. It's our prerogative as a nation both to try to guard ourselves against espionage, which is I think the assumption of national security stuff here. Espionage or subtle attempts at control, but really it's espionage. It's our prerogative to guard ourselves against that. And it's also our prerogative to make the best economic decisions we can for Americans. And so I think looking at it from both of those angles, I'm into the idea of like promoting more American manufacturing, more high-tech innovation, all this good stuff back at home. I think that would do more good than ill. What I don't like is it seems like, and this I keep bringing the reserve currency up, and maybe I'm misunderstanding some things, but I've also, I'll put it this way. This is a slightly different topic. I have a couple friends, one of whom was at the Fed for a little while. He was a grant writer or a paper writer or something like that at the Fed. And then he went on, he's a high-tech venture capital dude now in San Francisco. I should say maybe an associate, not so much a friend. But we talk sometimes, we get along pretty well. Anyway, a couple of years back, I was trying to get a sense. I reached out to him kind of like I hadn't talked in a while. I kind of sent him a cold message on Facebook. I was trying to figure out the sense of what determines the value of the U.S. currency. And he basically said one word, petrodollar. If you look at the purchasing of U.S. dollars, basically, it's a weird way to put it, but that's effectively how it is. Countries purchase the U.S. dollar by selling oil, and then they're able to reinvest that dollar wherever they want to, but usually that goes back into the States. And so they sort of sell their oil in exchange for a portion of assets in the States is effectively how that works. And that process largely supports our currency. Now, fracking has come along. There are various things that have come along to disrupt the petrodollar, and that's why this was a bit of a segue. But the centrality of our currency, and the nature of the currency internationally, the fact that the USD is the world's reserve currency, that's going to have this dramatic impact on a lot of things, not least of which, through the Triffin dilemma, the Triffin paradox, is that we have a disincentive to manufacture and an incentive to consume. So they can go in so many different directions, and I don't want to open up too many threads. But coming back to the topic at hand, the thing we're actually talking about, if we want to get back to manufacturing, I don't think we can have it both ways. I think we're going to have to shift away from the reserve currency status. I think we're going to have to give that up, because otherwise we have this huge disincentive to not manufacture things. And so it's like we're working against ourselves. We can't get the best of both worlds. We can't have that cake and eat it too. That's my take, and that's a larger conversation that I don't really hear happening in the public sphere. I'm sure it's happening behind the scenes in some rooms in the White House occasionally. And at the Fed, various Fed banks, many other places, I'm sure this kind of thing is being talked about. But I wish we had that conversation, because it would be so much more informative. It would be talking about the economics. It would be talking about the geopolitical aspects. There's a bit of history there, but it's not that hard to learn. And if my sense is, and I think I'm right about this stuff in broad terms, if I'm right about this stuff, that's a really important conversation we should be having as a public. That's my take.
That is an important conversation we should have as a public, and oftentimes we don't. When we're looking at our world, oftentimes the conversation doesn't get that in depth, if we're being just bluntly honest. The fact of the matter is that the part of the reason why the incentive structure exists to build a product in China that you could build for, let's say, $3, but you're paying the American worker here for 15, is for that specific reason. Cheaper. It became cheaper to produce. And in being cheaper to produce, you move those products around the globe and you just ship them back into the country by getting rid of trade deals and those type of things that would basically allow those products to be built elsewhere, but shipped back into the country at a dirt cheap cost. So I agree with you in the sense that it is an uneasy conversation to have, to tell people that, look, I understand you like shopping at Walmart, but you need to pay X number of dollars more in order to get this product, because it's in your best interest as a country to have people who are working at the various stores and who are producing those products to create an incentive for those people to produce them here. And so Trump argument of make America great again, and this notion that we're going to bring back manufacturing and whatnot, that's a valid argument to have. The consequences of that argument also have to be had, which means that, yeah, you can get that product working here, but either you're going to pay that guy $15, $20 an hour in order for that person to live, or you're going to pay that guy nothing, and you're going to pay somebody in China $3. And the question becomes, how on earth do you deal with that? And if you're arguing about that entirely from one side of it, where you completely and entirely ignore the repercussions of doing so, and this is not an argument for or against it, this is just an argument of reality, that if you are indeed going to build a product in the States and you want that product built in the States, you're going to pay more for it. Now, if you don't like that, and I'm talking about you, Shane, I'm just talking about people in general, because, like, I agree, the conversation is not had in those terms. If you don't like that, well, then you're going to have to somehow accept or create an economy that is perfectly okay with certain jobs not being in the United States and those jobs being abroad, meaning the impossibility of bringing those jobs back here because of just the basic incentives and drives in creating various products. We don't take into account the environmental costs of doing business. And so that stuff gets kind of thrown off as we tend to focus on the very specific thing of our jobs being pushed overseas. Yeah, but that's not magic.
It would be destabilizing.
It would be.
It would destabilize. I mean, I'll focus on two things. You've got the media, which benefits from polarization because it brings in profit, and then you have the fundamental political structure that creates the polarization that benefits from it. The Democratic and Republican parties. If you bring people together on a broad-based message, that's destabilizing for both of those parties, because obviously neither of those parties can express a broad-based message. If they were to do so, they'd have to do so against the grain of what brings them money, which is polarizing the members of their party against the other to get their favorite sons elected, to get their establishment, their own constituencies, their own politicians elected. If you want that broad-based message, it's got to come from outside. And of course, there's this disincentive from their perspective. They don't want that to happen, so it doesn't happen. I mean, it sounds a little bit conspiratorial, but I think, and maybe there are some conspiracies behind the scenes. You can't ever really fully discount those. But also just looking at it on that broad level, it makes sense. It makes sense structurally why they wouldn't want to have that conversation. It would betray their economic interests.
Yes, those exactly. When I look at this stuff, I look at this stuff as incentives. What way does the wind blow? Because if you put 1,000 people in, if the wind is blowing a particular way, well, those 10 people, just out of probability, tend to go in a particular direction, which means you kind of have to look at the system that the people are functioning in when they come up with an assessment of the world. We have a caller, Keith from Virginia. Keith, what's going on?
Yes, interesting topic and great show as usual. But getting back to this coming war against China, and that's what John Pilger, a famous author, news reporter, and filmmaker, he's got a film called The Coming War Against China, which he claims the Five Eyes countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Britain, America, they were going to ring fence China in. They're blocking up the South China Sea. I think that you're right that the problem with the U.S. is that if they decouple from globalization, which would be good for climate change and all that, and everyone goes back, stops all the cross-country, cross-shipping of tons of fuel from ships to ship things back and forth across the globe, it's a bad footprint on the ecosystem. But going back to China, my understanding, and I could be off a bit, 18 out of the last 20 centuries, China was the world's largest economy. They're not trying to catch up. They're just going back to where they were. They're unstoppable, and they've got a, how could I put it? Their 5G is superior to ours. And if you don't use China's, you're going to pay a third more, so you're trapped on that. And if you continue with your other tool, which is the weaponization of the U.S. dollar, i.e. the world currency, the world reserve currency, they've gotten hip to that, and they're deciding that, why should I give you an IOU, which you'll never have to pay me? And then if I demand anything or want something that you don't want to give me, then you not only do you keep my investments in Treasury, you use them to fund the very military that will take me out. This is a no-win situation. So they've created the Eurasian trading bloc with Russia, the Eurasian countries, and Iran, and they're going to use something other than the dollar. But they're dying to get off of this stuff, and for good reason. If they don't get off of it, it's just, an IOU that will never be paid, and also they weaponize. So my whole point is this. The Thucydides trap simply says, in history, whenever there are two superpowers, the one that's descending to prevent the ascending power from taking over usually goes to war. And I think that's the only option, but that would be suicide. So maybe it isn't an option, and I'll leave it at that.
All great points. Very on point. Thank you for the call. I think this is the first time I've heard your voice, Keith. Please forgive me if it wasn't and I'm forgetting it, but that was great. Please call back in. That was fantastic. And to your point about the 18 out of the last 20 centuries, another aspect of this, as far as I can tell, China is the oldest continuously running state. Like they've had various, there's this constant process of people invading from the north, whether it's the Manchus or just various tribes invading from the north and sort of reestablishing new states. But if you take those into account, it's about 4,000 years now that there has been a continuous process handing down of different forms of states with state capacity, building it up. So that's long. If I had to put the three sort of international competitors on a list, my favorite would be the U.S., my second favorite would be Russia, my third favorite would be China. I'm not especially fond of a lot of the stuff that China does, but in terms of exceptionalism, they're a pretty darn exceptional country in that way. Again, please, if I'm wrong, somebody fact check me on that. But from what I've heard, from what I've read, literally 4,000 years of constant state building and constant sort of state renewal. So it's just very interesting. And because of that, there's a lot more to learn there. Even for people in the West, for people from any want to learn how they were able to do that, and therefore how you can sustain your own society, your own civilization. That's pretty darn important. In any event, we should go into a break right now. We'll be back in a minute with David Lugo, who's a documentary filmmaker. We're going to be talking about Roger Stone and Randy Credico. A little bit more than that, too, I'm sure. Maybe some of this culture war stuff we started the show off with this morning at 7:15. We'll be back with him in just a minute. You're listening to Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Deshaun, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined now by David Lugo. He's a producer, writer, and director. We're talking about Roger Stone. David, are you with us?
Yes, sir. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good. Yeah, big turnover with the show, so everything's been a little bit crazy since then, but we're kind of settling in, I think. Yeah, actually, and just
I've enjoyed it so far.
Good to hear. Just out of curiosity, where are you located these days? We met back in D.C. a while back, I think, but where are you now?
I live in Philadelphia.
Okay, cool. Still on the East Coast. I'm just checking. Easy thing to check in about these times. Just curious. It's with the coronavirus stuff, and then with Black Lives Matter. I'm just curious to check in where people are. Sometimes they get interesting perspectives on things. In any event, we had Tyler P. Nixon on yesterday. We were talking about Roger Stone, also Randy Credico, this conflict between the two. And one of the things he brought up was a threat that please correct me if I'm getting this wrong, that I believe Randy Credico made against you, where he was threatening to leave a hole in your head or something. That's a pretty weird way to start, an oblique angle to come from onto the story. But if that's true, what am I getting wrong there? What happened?
No, that's correct. It's true. I testified in front of the grand jury. That was a story, but I did tell them I never felt threatened. I don't know if you've seen pictures of Randy, an elderly old man. I don't think I'm not really too worried about him, and that's what I told the grand jury. But essentially what had happened was back in 2018, I had gone on the War Room with Jacob Angles and told my story because I was having conversations with Randy behind the scenes as I was seeing him brought into the forefront of the Mueller investigation. And some of those conversations were rather disturbing, and I just, I know personally what he had told me because Randy was the person who worked for a film Sensational, and he introduced me to Roger Stone. And one day when I was interviewing Roger Stone, or prior to interviewing Roger Stone, we went to a coffee shop, and I asked him how he knew Roger, and, he said I was the guy who connected him with the WikiLeaks stuff. So that's how I know that Randy's story wasn't as truthful as he says. And everything I've been saying, all the text messages, emails, Facebook conversations, have been reviewed by the FBI, and they confirmed in front of me and my lawyer that they believe what I'm saying to be true.
Okay, and I believe you too. I'm curious, and again, that was a sort of rush place to start, but it's also kind of a very interesting place to start. But maybe now that we've begun there, we can back up a little bit. You got involved in this stuff, as far as I can tell, as you were directing the film you mentioned, Sensational, your film. Can you tell us why you got into that, what that film was about, where people can find it, that kind of thing, with an idea for setting them up to understand your involvement in the story?
Well, it actually started prior to the 2016 election. I was really interested in the alternative media, and then I helped produce another documentary with Oliver Stone called A Good American. We followed the life story of Bill Benny, the former technical director of the NSA, and that was directed by an Austrian director, Friedrich Muser. So during that time period, I had met Bill, and I had the opportunity to discuss the VIPs, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, experiment on the Christopher 2 downloads. And they began telling me about how the election was not hacked, it was a leak. Essentially, the same argument that Roger has been bringing up, and Bill, he tried getting Bill into the hearing. So I thought that was fascinating. I began doing some research and interviews. I started reaching out to people from the progressive left and the more conservative right, just to see essentially what your show does, to see both sides of the story and find if there's any common ground. Randy had helped me distribute Good American on his talk show. I forget the name of it, but that's how we met, and then I had hired him to be a production consultant for Sensational. And during that time period, he introduced me to pretty much 75% of the people, everyone in our film Sensational, except for your father, Lee. I had reached out to him independently, and to Barrett Brown. He's a more progressive commentator. So during that time, I wanted to figure out what was going on, and I soon learned that I was right in the middle of the Roger Stone, Randy Credico saga, and I just felt compelled to come out and say my story. After I said that, Randy began assaulting me with text messages. Late at night, 1 a.m., drunken rant. First one, he sent me my interview on War Room, and then confirmed the reason I told you was because I told 100 other people. He said Roger was going to be telling everybody that I was the middleman. So he confirmed what I said was true. And then he just continued to assault me. I think it was the entire summer of 2018. I can rely heavily on a drunken rant from Randy Credico around midnight to 1 a.m. So I just became more vocal in this topic, and eventually one day in October, the FBI arrived at my house. I let them into my office, and we went through all my emails, all my text messages, all my Facebook messages without a subpoena, because I just wanted to show them. And it really opened my eyes, because I set out to do a documentary about sensationalism, and here I have a person who worked on that film sensationalizing probably one of the biggest media stories in our country's history. So from that moment on, I became pretty active, and I use my filmmaking as my tool to kind of express my opinion.
But the Roger Stone thing, you're accepting that the FBI, after looking at all of that, came away with the assessment that basically Stone was lying about his connections. But I think the point that you're making is those lies were basically given to Stone from Credico. You're trying to say Credico was basically the person who was bringing this up in a way that got Roger Stone interested.
Let's go back. November, I have it right here, November 14th, 2018, Anna Schechter from NBC News releases text messages from Randy Credico to Roger Stone. And here he confirms what every one of us have been saying. Hillary's campaign will die this week, telling about the drops. So, Randy has admitted these things. He has admitted, and he has been called out. And when Anna dropped this article, he said, well, those are lies. They distorted the text messages. They're missing text messages. Okay, let's go back to another source. April 11th, 2019, on MSNBC, Anna Schechter, the woman who released that article, is sitting directly to the right of Randy Credico. Now, the two of them have been going back and forth over the internet. Randy swears everything she was saying was a lie. Anna has confirmed her reporting and backed by it and stood by it. He never once mentioned anything to Anna. They didn't have a debate on that show. They just glossed over it. Okay, let's go further. Just recently, after the case is done, Randy Credico says he never felt threatened and that he doesn't believe Roger Stone should be in jail. Everything you've seen with Randy's story has just come out and kind of shown that I think he got put in a very difficult position. And mind you, in my initial interview on the War Room, I came out and said I consider Randy Credico a friend, a person with a good heart. I just believe that he's being forced to do something that's not right.
I don't doubt your story. I accept that Credico lied. I thoroughly. except that Credico embellished. Credico would say himself that there were a lot of embellishments or exaggerations or just outright lies. I guess I'm getting to the notion of why was Stone the culprit in all of this, if indeed the federal government, and look, this is not me agreeing or disagreeing. This is more just the question in itself. So there's nothing behind the question in regards to a point of view that's saying this is right or wrong. That's not where I'm coming from. It's somewhat of a more general question. The FBI looked at all of this information. They went through Credico, they went through Stone and everyone else, but they came away with the assessment that Stone was the one that ultimately lied to Congress. Now, do you think that's legit? I mean, even if Credico lied to Stone, at some point Stone became aware that what he was saying wasn't true. So, are you saying in a tacit way that the charges against Stone were not right? Because look, I agree with you that they should have commuted the sentence for Stone, but I do think Stone did commit a crime, going before Congress. I even agree with you that it's selective, meaning when Brennan or when Clapper made their whoppers before Congress, there was no consequences, but they did go after Stone in this kind of punitive way. I guess what I'm asking is, why go after Stone but not go after Credico?
It's an amazing question. And in my opinion, because I was not in the room, I don't have any association with him lying to Congress. I don't know that story. I just believe that the sentence did not match it. And let's be honest, who was the man who got President Trump to run for president? It was Roger Stone. I mean, I don't think it's any mystery that there is political tit for tat in this country right now, which has to stop because it's dividing us. I believe that okay, let's say that he did lie and in front of Congress. What was George Papadopoulos' sentence for lying to the FBI? 14 days or something like that. How do you get 4 years? And they initially wanted 7 years. I mean, this had more of a vendetta as opposed to justice.
Yeah, I agree with you. It came across as spiteful and vindictive, including the way they descended on his house like it was some kind of compound, and he was going to come out shooting. So I entirely agree with you on that front. Credico has been interesting to me in this. Yeah. I mean, I've met him partially, and it's one of those questions, well, if you accept that Stone was basically just repeating something that he heard from Credico, at which point does one claiming honesty and does the other being continued to dishonest, how much of a consequence should come from that? And as you noted, the other people, Flynn and Papadopoulos, I have to be honest, all of this came across as being political witch hunts to me, even if certain people were guilty of various crimes. In regards to the Trump administration, Stone getting him elected and everything else, what aspect of government do you think was engaged in this culprit? Meaning, there has to be a conscious thing being made somewhere, a conscious choice being made somewhere to descend upon his house like a compound. It has to be a conscious choice and decision made somewhere to go after Papadopoulos or to, for that matter, decide to leave Credico out but go after Stone. I'm interested into whether or not your relationship with Stone has revealed people who were at odds with him that might have been in positions of power to basically push through these type of policies.
My relationship with Stone is very minimal. It's just a documentary. But I do believe that there is a Adam Schiff is a figure I believe who wants he's looking for blood. He's headhunting right now, and he prior to all of this nonsense going down, he had a private meeting with Randy. Adam Schiff had a private meeting with Randy Credico, and Randy was attempting to get Julian Assange freed. And then after that, basically they said they had the indictment out for, they had an indictment out for Julian Assange. I think that people like that, and mainly the intelligence agency. Let's cut through all the BS. We now know through all the unclassified documents that there was some pretty bad stuff going on. And the FBI in January 4th, tapping wires on Flynn or getting the 302. Then the next day, the heads of our intelligence agencies and our president and our vice president say, let's go ahead. I think, again, like Bill Benny says, there was no hack. I believe there was a leak, and there are people in the intelligence agencies who know this, and that's why this has gone as far as it is. They needed to divert our attention from the fact that progressives and conservatives alike believe that the intelligence agencies have far too much power to invade our privacy and to manipulate the media. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at the intelligence agencies overreaching, in my opinion.
That is the voice of David Lugo. We have him on for another segment, so we'll be back with him in just a minute. He's a producer, writer, and he's the director of the film Sensational, featuring a bunch of people, including Roger Stone, also Lee Stranahan, my dad, and the former host of the show. We'll be back with David Lugo to continue this conversation in just a minute. Until then, please know you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined now by David Lugo. He's a producer, writer, and he's the director of Sensational, the film Sensational. We're having a conversation about Roger Stone. We've been talking about the details of the back and forth between Roger Stone and Randy Credico. It's been interesting. This one's especially interesting because Randy Credico is, as far as I can tell, been one of the sort of core members of the movement to free Julian Assange. And so just putting it out there on the table, a lot of this would look like infighting. And so it touches on sort of, it's touchy to talk about, but we're getting into the facts, and I think we're doing a pretty good job of keeping it unemotional. Anyway, David, I just wanted to sort of set that up. Quick question here. We brought up Steve Bannon yesterday in the interview with Tyler P. Nixon. He seems to me like a core figure. It seems like he gave mixed testimony that might have gotten Roger Stone, put him in a much worse position than he otherwise would have been in. Basically, it seems like Steve Bannon stabbed him in the back, just putting it bluntly. Do you know much about that? Could you help to sort of remind me, fill the listeners in on what the details of that were?
Unfortunately, I don't know too much about the Steve Bannon situation. Only from what I read in the papers and online. But again, as you mentioned, I believe it's infighting, and I think there are multiple factions in this country, trying to reach the top of the mountain, and we're forgetting all the collateral damage at the bottom.
That's actually, so that brings me to something interesting. The title of your film is Sensational. You were talking earlier about how Randy Credico specifically, but how this story was sensationalized. There is a sort of dangling thread that I wanted to pull this back into at the end of what you just said. We're talking about infighting. We're talking about infighting not just on the small scale, but on a national scale. And it seems like there's a direct relationship between that and the sensationalization of various things that people do, playing up the bad sides, playing up the good sides, whatever the case may be, to sort of fight the out group and defend the in group, quote unquote. How do you, again, this is an open-ended question exactly, because I'm just sort of curious to hear your take on this. You directed a movie called Sensational. What's your perspective on that dynamic, and what do you think about that?
Well, I didn't want to believe it going into the project, but seeing how this whole story is unfolded, it's disheartening to see certain reporters and how they approach the media. In terms of how I think, we get past this, what you two are doing, bring together opposing points of view. And I guarantee you, once you get the people in the suits and all the people who go up on the Capitol Hill who claim that they work for us, once you get them out of the equation, you start realizing that we may disagree on policy, but, you're still my brother or sister, no matter what. We live in this country together. We this is our land. So, allowing media reports that have skewed views and, obviously, biased information to continue to drive that wedge between us is unfortunate. But I am encouraged by seeing shows like this, by meeting people like Barrett Brown. He's part of Progressive, but he even called out Randy Credico. He called out Randy Credico multiple times. So this isn't just, all the conservatives are going after Randy. It's a lot of people just starting to say, hey, listen, if we don't support the truth, then this country is in for a lot of trouble. And, we're seeing the rocky road right now.
David, when you started this project, what have you learned in this project, or what perspective did this project bring to you that wasn't necessarily there before you started the project? It does sound like you've had this kind of arc in the way that you've been seeing the world as a result of, let's say, the environmental response to you being ensconced in this particular type of work in your film.
What I learned is that everyone has an agenda, and that doesn't mean everyone's being nefarious, but everyone has their story or their point of view. So taking anything as gospel and saying, this is all I'm going to listen to, because this guy talks about what I like, I mean, it just doesn't work. So getting out of your comfort zone, feeling uncomfortable with certain pieces of information, but understanding how to. One of the interviewees in our film is a woman named Pax Tandon. She's a mindfulness expert. So we incorporate this woman into the film by teaching people how to take in this news and be mindful about it. Because we feel that anger, we feel that rage sometimes, like, oh my God, I can't believe they're saying this, or I can't believe they're saying that. But if you breathe, focus on it, you look at the source, you look at, what that outlet, their objective is, and then go find somebody on the complete opposite side, and then you kind of piece together things. I mean, I believe that in the 21st century, we are all going to have to be researchers. And that I didn't feel as much in the beginning, but I'm 100% certain now that we can't just say, I listen to CNN and that's where I get my news. Can't be. I can't, I'm on Sputnik Radio with you two right now, and I will go listen to something else that, probably doesn't like Sputnik Radio tomorrow. And I'm not going to say Sputnik Radio is bad. I'm not going to say they're bad. I think absolutism is very dangerous for us. And so that's what I learned. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
This gets into this idea of cancel culture. I mean, almost directly. And we were talking about that at the beginning of the show, how there are some ideas that you're not going to fancy for various reasons that you're not going to fancy them. Some of them may be outright and utterly atrocious, but there needs to be the space in your society for people to be able to make those ideas without necessarily entirely being canceled, especially when sometimes those ideas are just subjective. It sounds like that's where you're coming from in this argument. And I can't say I disagree with you in this argument. Everybody has an agenda. I was trying to tell my mom that. I was like, if you're watching CNN or you're watching MSNBC, those companies have certain thought processes and certain ideas that they like to propagate and that they try to hide otherwise. Economics was one of those main issues that, if you notice, never really came up for debate and conversation outside of maybe the last 8 years with the Sanders, who has somewhat of a different philosophy in regards to governance. By the same token, those ideas get pushed to the side. I mean, if you're looking at Ventura on the issues of war, Phil Donahue on the issues of war, and I even like to point out the Star Trek episode where, the UK didn't particularly like them trying to reconcile and try to deal with the topic of terrorism, especially in the context of terrorism eliciting some level of results, and the UK not necessarily liking the messy complexity associated with trying to deal with things that have outcomes that you consider, or a power structure consider, to be disastrous, but other people consider to be just utterly necessary. It sounds like this is where you're coming from. Am I wrong in my explanation of this point of view?
No, you are 100% correct. Point in case, my family came from Cuba. My family is very big in the Tropicana. We helped build it, and my great uncle was chased out the night Che stormed Havana. So that gives me more of a libertarian conservative bend. I'm very upfront with that. But that does not mean my company will only work on those sorts of projects. For instance, after the George Floyd incident, we made it our objective to help the Black and brown community by doing what we do. So we provided $25,000 to a production here in Philadelphia of women of color who are a little more onto the left. I don't want to cancel them. Say the world comes up tomorrow and we're right wing all the way. I'll still be supporting my brothers and sisters on the left because they are my brothers and sisters. Just because you like black socks and not white socks, or white socks and not black socks, I'm not going to judge you. And what you're saying is 100% correct. We have to stop doing that. It's toxic. It's horrible for a country. It's horrible for the world in general, not just the country. It's horrible for the world. We are dividing each other over issues that, at the end of the day, if you're out at a club dancing, are you really going to be, divided over politics? No, you're going to dance with the person next to you. I think that's what we need to do. We need to get back into saying politics is it's like football. For that game, you can have two sides. But when you go out into the park and not be friends, understand that you're going to have to be cordial with each other and just respect each other. Essentially is what my point of view in this world is, and that's what I want to do with my company. I'm in the film and entertainment industry. I'm going to work with people from all aspects of the world. And I don't care what your political affiliation is. We need to stop canceling people. I mean, I think you both are aware of the Terry Crews, Don Lemon interview, which, I respect Terry Crews so much for what he's trying to do. And I just believe Don Lemon wasn't trying to hear him at all. That's not what we need. We need stuff like your show. We need stuff where, people can disagree, but still smile and shake hands at the end of the day.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate the work you're doing too. In our last couple of minutes here, what projects do you have coming up? What's in the works right now?
We actually are, I'm producing a film called Not Without Hope, with Miles Teller, Russell Wilson, and Sierra. We were just in the Cannes market a couple weeks ago, and I am also producing an animated film with the team from Ratatouille, Daisy Ridley, Stephen Fry, and Michael Keaton. So those are two of the bigger projects that we're working on right now, but we're always open for new projects. We have a film coming out, executive produced with Spike Lee, directed by Barry Alexander Brown, called Son of the South, about the civil rights movement in the 60s. We have a lot coming out. Last year was pretty good for us to produce 20 films, and they'll all be trickling out over the next year.
That's awesome. That's great. And for people who want to check out Sensational, to learn more about the story that we're talking about, especially in our first segment 15 minutes ago, where should they go to watch that?
That is sensationalfilm.com. On that website, it'll take you to a direct link. We'll be available right now on Vimeo, and we will be available on more websites in the fall. But right now, sensationalfilm.com, you'll see news articles surrounding the film and different clips from each of the interviewees to give you a little background on the film.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, David.
My pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen. Keep up the good work.
Hey, you too. For everybody who's been listening, you have been listening to the voice of David Lugo. He's a producer, writer, and director. Today we were talking about the events surrounding the film Sensational, his film Sensational, having to do with Roger Stone, Randy Credico, the Mueller investigation, this whole Russiagate story. It's interesting. It's interesting. Oh, not to mention, Lee Stranahan was in the film too. He was my dad, the former co-host of the show. So there's a connection to the show directly in an interesting way. Good show today, Jamarl.
Absolutely. Great conversations. Really interesting conversations, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the last stuff you were saying there, I'm a little bit pensive. I'm still thinking about the conversation specifically you guys were having about trying to break these divides down. Maybe that's not the right way of putting it, but bring people together. You know what I mean? It's not easy.
I mean, like, Because sometimes political disposition gets into real world phenomena. Like if I believe that you shouldn't have health care, but that's a political disposition, but that is affecting you.
Yeah.
So, it's not easy. I don't take it as being easy, but I do think it is necessary, whether it's easy or not.
Let's keep it up. Let's try to get into it. For everybody who's been listening, you've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back tomorrow from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Have a good day, everybody. Fault Lines. Signing off.
As always, I appreciate you guys joining us for the show. I am going to end this here with a like, a share, and subscribe. You may see me later on this evening. If not, you'll definitely see me tomorrow, and of course, all day tomorrow. But more likely than not, you'll probably even see me later today. But thank you all for joining us. Absolutely. Fault Lines, 7 to 10.